Hey there and welcome back. If you are settling in right now, maybe the lamp is low, maybe there is a cup of something warm beside you, good. Because tonight's story is one of those that asks for stillness. It asks you to sit with a person who has for nearly 90 years been treated less as a person and more as a cautionary tale. As always, I'd love to know where in the world are you listening from, and what time is it for you. And if you enjoy these cozy journeys through history, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next one. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Her name has been attached to a scandal, a villain in a story about a king. Tonight we are going to try something different. Tonight we are going to try to find the woman. Her name was Bessiewallis Warfield. She was born in a small wooden cottage in the hills of Pennsylvania in the summer of 1896, and she died in a tall, quiet house in the Bois de Boulogne in Paris in the spring of 1986. In between those two dates, she did something that almost no one else in the 20th century managed to do. She caused a king of England to give up his throne, not by plotting, not by ambition, just, in the end, by being the person he could not stop loving. That is the version of the story you probably know. A divorced American woman, twice married already, who somehow bewitched the most eligible man in the world and brought down a 1,000-year monarchy in the process. It is a tidy story. It has a villain and a victim and a moral. And like most tidy stories, it is mostly wrong tonight. Over the next several hours, we are going to take that story apart and rebuild it from the inside out. We are going to sit at the kitchen tables of Baltimore and the dinner tables of London. We are going to ride through the cold to a hunting lodge in Leicestershire on a January night in 1931 and meet, almost by accident, the man who will rearrange every life he touches. We are going to hear what was said in Cannes in December of 1936 by a woman genuinely trying to step away. And we are going to follow the long, quiet aftermath, the decades in Paris, the dinners, the slow erosion of a mind, the question of who Wallis Simpson actually was when there was finally no one left to perform for. So get comfortable, pour something warm. We are going somewhere far away in time, and somewhere quite close in feeling. Let us begin. There is a particular kind of family in late 19th century America that the history books do not often pause on, and I think they should. The family that used to have money. The family whose name still meant something in the local registers, whose pew at church still bore the right brass plate, whose grandfather had served in the right regiment, but whose actual cash, the day-to-day money that pays for coal in the winter, and a maid in the kitchen, and a respectable dress for the daughter's debut, had quietly evaporated. That is the family Wallis was born into. The Warfields of Maryland were old. They had come over from England in the 17th century, settled along the Chesapeake, accumulated land and political offices in the 18th century, and bled themselves white during the Civil War in the 19th. By the time Wallis was born, in 1896, the Warfields were what the South politely called reduced, still proud, still respectable, still the sort of name that opened a few important doors in Baltimore, but broke. Genuinely, ordinarily, sit up late doing the accounts broke. Her father was Tackle Wallis Warfield, a young man of 26, slim, gentle, well-mannered, and very ill. By the time he married her mother, Alice Montague, in November of 1895, the tuberculosis that had been quietly working through him for years was already advanced. The wedding was small. The honeymoon was a journey to a resort in the Pennsylvania mountains where the air was supposed to be good for the lungs. It was at one of those mountain resorts in a wooden cottage at Blue Ridge Summit that their daughter was born on the 19th of June, 1896. They named her Bessiewallis, Bessie after her aunt, Wallis after her father. It was, even at the time, an unusual name for a girl. 5 months after she was born, on the 15th of November, her father died. He was 27 years old. The baby was barely sitting up. Now I want you to picture what this meant in practical terms, because the practical terms are everything a young widow of 27 with no income, an infant daughter, and a husband's family that was frankly not in a position to help her in any sustained way. Her own family, the Montagues of Virginia, were no wealthier than the Warfields. There was a brother-in-law of considerable means, Solomon Davies Warfield, a banker and railroad executive in Baltimore, but his help came in the form of arrangements rather than cash. He helped them find a place to live. He provided allowance irregularly when he could be persuaded. He paid for the schooling, eventually, but the day-to-day, the rent, the food, the clothes, the doctor's visits, that fell to Alice. And Alice, with no training and no profession and a child to raise, did what genteelly poor widows in 19th century America were forced to do. She took in lodgers. She moved from one set of cheap rooms to another. She accepted, when she had to, the charity of her sister's household. And she taught her daughter, in ways that probably never required a single explicit conversation, that the difference between dignity and humiliation in this world was money you did not have. This is the first thing to understand about Wallis. The poverty was not abstract. It was not the sort of poverty that gets called modest circumstances in a polite biography. It was the daily, grinding, watchful poverty of a child who knows exactly which of her cousins has a new dress and which of her schoolmates has a horse, and who learns very young that there is a particular set of skills, charm, observation, the ability to make oneself agreeable, that can substitute partially for what the bank account does not provide. Her mother helped. Alice Warfield was, by all accounts, a quick, witty, sharp-tongued woman with a gift for turning misfortune into a story you could laugh at. She was not bitter. She was, in the way of women of her class and era, resourceful. She remarried twice, both times to men who could not quite carry her financially the way she might have hoped. She took her daughter to live with her wealthier sister. She borrowed money from her wealthier brother-in-law. She kept up appearances when keeping up appearances was a full-time occupation, and Wallis watched. Wallis watched all of it. There is a quality you sometimes find in the children of the genteelly poor that I think is worth naming, because it shows up in Wallis again and again through the rest of her life. It is the quality of having learned early that no one is coming to rescue you, that if you want a place at the table, you will have to make yourself indispensable to the people who already have the chairs. That charm is not a luxury, but a tool. That noticing, really noticing, who someone is and what they want and what they need to hear, is the closest thing a young woman without money has to a profession. By the time Wallis was 10, she was already, by the accounts of those who knew her, a remarkable child. Not pretty. She was never going to be conventionally pretty. Her chin was too strong, her face too angular, her features too definite for the soft-eyed, pink-cheeked ideal of late Victorian girlhood. But she was something better than pretty. She was interesting, she was funny, she had an attentiveness that made adults feel listened to. She had her mother's wit and her father's gentleness, and on top of that she had the watchfulness that the situation had produced in her. The watchfulness of a child who had learned that survival depended on understanding the room. She went to a small, exclusive girls' school in Baltimore. She was sent there on her uncle's money, which her mother accepted with a complicated mixture of gratitude and resentment that Wallis absorbed without ever quite being able to name. She was in that school, surrounded by girls whose families had what hers did not. The old Baltimore families, the new industrial fortunes, the girls whose summers were spent in the right places, whose winters involved the right dancing masters, whose dresses came from the right shops in New York, and she learned to be the most interesting person in the room. Not the richest, not the most beautiful, not the most pedigreed, but the one you wanted to sit next to at lunch, the one whose conversation you sought out, the one whose approval somehow you found yourself caring about, even though by every measurable standard of that society, she should have been beneath your notice. That is the foundation. That is what Baltimore made. Hold on to it, because in roughly 35 years, the same skill, the skill of being the most interesting person in a room without being the richest, will be exercised across a dinner table at a hunting lodge in Leicestershire, and the man who finds himself unable to stop thinking about her afterwards will be the heir to the throne of England. Let me give you a sense of what daily life was actually like for Wallis as a child in Baltimore, because the surface details matter for understanding what happened later. The Baltimore of the early 1900s was a city of about 500,000 people, the 8th largest in America, an old port town on the Chesapeake Bay that had been settled in the 17th century and that retained, into the 20th, the slightly sleepy formality of a southern city that had never quite become northern. The summers were brutal. The humidity from the bay rolled inland in a wet, suffocating wave that lasted from late May to early October. Air conditioning did not yet exist. The wealthy escaped to mountain resorts in Pennsylvania or Virginia. The middle classes opened the windows and tried to sleep on the porches. The poor sweated through it. Wallis and her mother lived, for most of her childhood, in a series of rented rooms in different houses around the genteel residential streets of Baltimore. The addresses changed. The arrangements shifted. At various points they boarded with Alice's sister Bessie. At various points they took rooms in lodging houses run by other widows in similar circumstances. At various points they had flats of their own. The financial picture, never stable, fluctuated with the moods of Uncle Solomon and the success or failure of Alice's various attempts at independent living. There were weeks when there was meat at every meal. There were weeks when there was none. There were Christmases with proper presents, and Christmases with token gifts, and the unspoken understanding that more would not be possible this year. There were dresses that had been turned and returned, the seams unpicked and re-sewn, so the worn edges of the fabric would not show. There were shoes that did not quite fit, kept for one more season because new ones were not in the budget. A child who grows up in this kind of household, the kind where appearances must be maintained, but funds are precarious, learns certain things very early. She learns that there are two registers in any conversation: the surface register, where everyone pretends, and the underground register, where the actual situation is being managed. She learns that the cost of every social occasion has been calculated, even when no one mentions it. She learns that gratitude is a complicated currency, not always pleasant to spend or to receive. She also learns, if she is a child like Wallis, to be invisible to the people who give her things, to not seem to notice the strain, to not draw attention to the borrowed dress or the cousin's old hand-me-down that has been altered to fit, to accept generosity when it comes with a lightness that suggests the giving was a pleasure to the giver, even when both parties know perfectly well it was not. These are the social skills of the genteelly poor. They are real skills. They take practice. By the time Wallis was 12, she had practiced them for a decade. By the time she was 16, they were as natural to her as breathing. Her mother, in some ways, was her best teacher. Alice Warfield had a particular kind of charm that Wallis would inherit and refine. Alice could turn an embarrassing situation into a joke that made everyone laugh. She could redirect a conversation away from a dangerous topic. She could make an unexpected guest feel welcomed at a tea where there had not, 15 minutes earlier, been quite enough cake. She had what an older generation would have called the social arts, and she had them in abundance, and she practiced them daily because she had to. Wallis watched. She absorbed. She refined. By her early teens, she was, by some accounts, already a slightly better version of her mother, quicker, sharper, more observant, able to read a room with an instinct that her mother had to think about. There was also the matter of her cousins. Wallis had cousins on both sides. The Warfields had been a large family before the Civil War, and although their numbers had been thinned by that conflict, there were still, by the 1900s, dozens of Warfield cousins of various ages scattered across Maryland and Virginia. The Montagues on her mother's side were similarly numerous. Wallis grew up in the constant company of these cousins. Holidays at her aunt's house, summers at this or that family farm, Christmases at the homes of her wealthier relatives, The cousins served, for her, as a kind of social training ground. Every cousin had a slightly different personality. Every cousin came from a slightly different financial situation. Every cousin was the entry point to a slightly different family network. Wallis, by the time she was a teenager, knew exactly who was related to who was in funds and who was struggling, who was respectable, and who was just on the edge of being whispered about. She had in her head a kind of social map of upper-middle-class Baltimore society, complete with all the relevant connections, that her cousins themselves did not always possess. This is knowledge of the sort that, deployed carefully in adult life, allows a clever woman without money to navigate complicated social situations with apparent effortlessness. It looks from the outside like instinct. It is, in fact, the result of a quiet decade of paying attention. There was also, in those Baltimore years, a closeness between Wallis and her mother that I think shaped her in ways she herself probably never fully traced. They were a unit, a team of two against a world that had not, by any reasonable accounting, been kind to either of them. Alice told her daughter everything, or close to everything, in a way that mothers of that era did not always tell their daughters. The financial worries, the romantic disappointments, the humiliations of having to ask for help again from people whose own lives were comfortable enough that they could afford to feel slightly burdened by giving it. Wallis grew up, as a result, with a precocious understanding of adult life. She knew before she was 12 what her mother's monthly income actually was and how it was spent. She knew which letters her mother wrote in the careful, deliberately cheerful tone that meant Alice was asking for money. She knew which relatives could be relied upon and which would always disappoint. She had, in short, practical knowledge of how the world actually worked, that most girls of her class were carefully shielded from until much later. This had effects, both useful and not. The useful effect was the social intelligence that would carry her through everything that followed. The less useful effect, the one that took longer to surface, was a certain kind of emotional vigilance that never quite turned off, a wariness, a constant low-level scanning of every situation for the catch, the cost, the hidden price that would have to be paid eventually. Wallis, even as a young woman, was rarely fully relaxed in social situations. She was always working, always reading, always calculating, with a calculation so practiced and so well hidden that her companions experienced it only as exceptional attentiveness. By the time Wallis was sent to Oldfields in 1912, she was already, in this hidden, never-discussed sense, a kind of social prodigy, not in the way that produces public achievements. In the way that produces, much later, a dinner table in London that everyone wants to be invited to. But that is a long way off. First, there is school. In 1912, when Wallis was 16, she was sent to Oldfields School in Maryland, a small, exclusive, very Episcopalian girls' boarding school set in the rolling country north of Baltimore. The motto of Oldfields was gentleness and courtesy are expected of the girls at all times, which, when you read it now, feels almost satirical, but at the time was the unembarrassed credo of a finishing school that taught young women how to be the wives of men who ran banks. Oldfields was paid for, again, by Uncle Solomon. By this point, the financial arrangement between Wallis's mother and her brother-in-law had settled into a pattern that everyone understood. He paid for the things that mattered for the family name: school fees, the right clothes for important occasions, the eventual debut. He did not pay for ordinary life. Alice and her daughter still lived in rented rooms. They still counted pennies. The contrast between the surface of Wallis's existence, the right school, the right address book, the right invitations, and the underside of it, the worry, the borrowing, the stretching, was the fundamental fact of her adolescence. She thrived at Oldfields. She was, the records suggest, an indifferent scholar. She did not particularly distinguish herself in any subject, but she was, again, the most popular girl in her class, quick with a comeback, generous with her time, a girl who organized the dance and remembered the birthdays and could be relied upon to know what was actually going on in the dormitory, when the housemistress had no idea. Her schoolmates in later interviews would recall her without much surprise at what she eventually became. Of course Wallis married well, they said. Of course Wallis ended up in London. They had seen, even at 16, the particular combination of social intelligence and absolute determination that the rest of the world would only meet much later. She graduated from Oldfields in the spring of 1914. The conventional plan for a girl of her class, was a debut into Baltimore society the following winter. The right party, the right white dress, the right introductions, the slow, formal beginning of the marriage market in which a young woman of good family but no money would have perhaps 2 or 3 seasons to find a husband before her market value began to decline. But the timing was bad. 2 things happened in the spring and summer of 1914 that complicated the plan. The first was personal. Uncle Solomon, the financial backbone of the entire operation, was suffering through a difficult time in his business affairs, which made him unwilling to fund a lavish debut. The second was global. In August of 1914, the war began. The Great War. The war that would, by the time it ended 4 years later, have rearranged every assumption about what young women of Wallis's class were supposed to do with their lives. Her debut, when it finally happened, was modest. She came out at the Bachelor's Cotillon in Baltimore in December of 1914, in a dress that had been carefully economized on, with the awareness, hers and everyone else's, that the season would be subdued. The grand parties of pre-war Baltimore were not happening. The young men her age were not yet in the war, since America was still neutral, but the war hung over everything. There was an air of suspended judgment about the whole social calendar. Wallis was not noticed in the way a debutante hopes to be noticed. She made no spectacular match. The autumn of 1915 came and went without an engagement. By the spring of 1916, she was 19 years old, with the clock of the marriage market beginning to tick more loudly and no obvious prospect on the horizon. And then, in April of 1916, she went to visit her cousin Corinne Mustin in Pensacola, Florida. Pensacola in 1916 was a Gulf Coast town with one significant feature. It was the home of the United States Naval Aeronautic Station, the only training base for naval aviators in the country. Corinne's husband was a senior officer at the base. The atmosphere, even before America entered the war, was one of nervous, glamorous, slightly reckless youth. Young men in uniform learning to fly the impossibly fragile flying machines of the era. The quiet knowledge that some of them soon would be sent into the war that was already chewing through a generation of European young men. Wallis, 19, single, sharp, and looking, met Earl Winfield Spencer Jr. at her cousin's house within days of arriving. He was 27, tall, lean, dark-haired, almost theatrically handsome. He was one of the first naval aviators in American history. He had qualified as Naval Aviator number 20 in 1914, when there were still only a handful of trained aviators in the entire United States Navy. He was charming, articulate, ambitious, and slightly dangerous in the way that men who fly experimental aircraft for a living tend to be slightly dangerous. Wallis was, by every account including her own, completely overwhelmed. I want to pause here and say something about that overwhelm, because it matters for everything that comes later. Wallis was 19. She had been raised in a household where money was tight and men were largely absent. Her father had died before she could remember him. Her stepfathers had not been substantial figures in her life. The men she had encountered in Baltimore society had been the gentle, tame, well-dressed sons of bankers, most of whom seemed to her, even at her young age, slightly dull. Win Spencer was not dull. He was a flyer. He had survived crashes that had killed his colleagues. He drank, by some accounts even at this stage, rather more than he should have. But in 1916, in a Florida naval town, that was not an unusual quality in a young aviator. He was in every sense that mattered to a 19-year-old girl from a slightly threadbare Baltimore household. An escape. They met in April. They were engaged within weeks. They married on the 8th of November 1916 in Baltimore, in a ceremony at her aunt's house. She was 20 years old. He was 28. The marriage went wrong almost immediately. I am going to handle what follows briefly, because the historical record is full of difficult detail, and there is no need to dwell on it. The essential facts are these. Win Spencer was an alcoholic. Whether he had been before the marriage, or whether the pressures of his work pushed him into it during it, the historians disagree. What is not in dispute is that within months of the wedding, Wallis was living with a man who drank heavily, who could be cruel when he drank, and who, on more than one occasion, frightened her badly enough that she sought refuge with her cousin or her mother. She did not leave him at first. Women of her class and era did not leave husbands easily. The divorce was a social catastrophe. Her mother had tried it once, and the consequences had shaped Wallis's whole childhood. She kept hoping, in the way that wives of difficult men have always kept hoping, that things would improve, that the next posting would be different, that the next promise would hold. It is worth pausing on what her life looked like in the daily texture of it during those years. Because the picture from the outside, in those first months especially, was not the picture from the inside. From the outside, Wallis Spencer was a young Navy wife of the kind that the American officer corps produced in considerable numbers in the years after the Great War. She lived in officers' housing on or near the various naval bases where her husband was stationed. She attended the official dinners at the officers' club. She wore the gloves and the hats and the slightly out-of-season dresses of a woman doing her best on a junior officer's salary. She was on every visiting list, was invited to every tea, was greeted at every social occasion by women who, like her, had married into the Navy and were navigating, like her, the intricacies of rank and protocol that governed the social life of a base. She was, by every report from the women who knew her in those years, the most popular young wife on every base she lived on. The officers' wives liked her. The senior wives, the formidable women who set the tone for every social gathering, approved of her. She remembered names. She wrote thank-you notes. She volunteered for the right committees and showed up reliably for the right charity events. She had, in short, the gift of being seen as a wife the Navy preferred its officers to have. Inside the marriage, things were different. The pattern, as best as we can reconstruct it from the few surviving accounts, was a cycle. There would be periods of relative calm. Win would be sober, attentive, charming. Wallis would think again that things were improving. There would be a few good weeks. Then something would happen, at work, with money, with one of his colleagues, and the drinking would start again, and within a few days the household would be back in the difficult place it had been before. The cycles got tighter as the years went on. The good periods became shorter. The difficult periods became more frequent. Wallis tried in those years to manage him. She tried to remove the alcohol from the house. She tried to plan their evenings around activities that would keep him occupied and away from the bottle. She tried in the desperate way of wives of alcoholics in every era to convert the energy of the marriage into a kind of sustained vigilance, a constant low-level project of damage limitation that occupied most of her waking hours. It did not work. It does not in those situations ever really work. The drinking was not a problem she could solve through more attentive management. The drinking was a separate fact with its own internal logic that operated on Win regardless of what Wallis did or did not do. The base postings did not help. Each new base meant a new social structure to learn, new neighbours to meet, new wives to get along with. The disruption of every move was, in itself, exhausting. Wallis arrived at each new posting having to start over, having to rebuild her social circle from scratch, having to perform once again the role of the cheerful young wife of the slightly difficult officer. The performance got harder each time. By 1920, she was beginning, in private letters to her closest friends, to use the language of a woman who is contemplating, very tentatively, that she may not be able to continue. She continued anyway. There were no obvious alternatives. The financial situation, never strong, became more precarious as Wynne's career, never quite as brilliant as he or she had hoped, settled into the comfortable mediocrity of an officer who would never be promoted to the senior ranks. Going home to her mother meant accepting publicly that the marriage had failed. Going home meant the long faces of relatives who had warned her, however gently, against marrying so young. Going home meant the slow, grinding poverty of her childhood, all over again, but now with the added shame of being a returned wife. She kept hoping. She kept staying. She kept, in the gradually accumulating language of her own private accounts of those years, getting older, without quite knowing how to get out. The postings did not help. Wynne was moved from Pensacola to Boston, then to San Diego, then, in 1922, to a posting in the Far East. The marriage by this point was effectively over in everything but name. Wallis remained in Washington for periods, living a separate life, working in the social network of naval wives and government employees, building, very quietly, the version of herself that would eventually emerge in London a decade later. In 1924, she made a decision that, looking back, was one of the most consequential of her life. She accepted Wynne's invitation to join him in the Far East, where he was now stationed. The marriage was, she hoped, going to get one last chance. It did not. Within weeks of her arrival in Hong Kong, the old patterns had returned, worse than before. Wallis left him within months. She did not go home. Going home meant the public failure of a marriage, the social shame of a divorce, the return to her mother's rooms, and the watchful disappointment of her relatives. Instead, she did something genuinely unusual for an American woman of her class in 1924. She stayed in Asia, alone. For the next year and a half, she lived a life that has been wrapped, for nearly a century afterwards, in more myth than fact. The basic outline is this. She travelled from Hong Kong to Shanghai. She lived for a period in Peking, in the household of an American couple, Catherine and Herman Rogers, who had a beautiful house in the diplomatic quarter and who would remain her closest friends for the rest of her life. She attended embassy parties. She learned to play mahjong rather well. She developed a real eye for Chinese porcelain and lacquerwork that would furnish her homes for the next 60 years. She travelled, she observed, she collected herself, she lived, in those Peking months, in a kind of suspended privilege that was to the era. The Western diplomatic and merchant communities in China in the 1920s occupied a position that the modern reader has to work to understand. They were not really citizens of China. They were not, in many respects, subject to Chinese law. They lived in compounds and quarters that were administered by their home governments. They had their own clubs, their own restaurants, their own newspapers, their own social hierarchies. The Chinese city, with its noise and its smells and its terrible poverty and its astonishing complexity, was something they observed mostly through their windows. Wallis lived inside this Western enclave with the Rogerses. The Rogers house was by every account beautiful, a traditional Chinese courtyard house with a quiet garden, with rooms that opened onto a sequence of interior spaces, with the slow, considered elegance of a building that had been adapted by Western residents who had paid attention to what was already there. Herman Rogers was the son of a wealthy New York family. He had no need to work, and he did not. He had come to Peking partly out of intellectual curiosity, partly because his wife Catherine had wanted to see the world, partly because the slow, observant life that was possible in Peking in the 1920s appealed to a man with the means to live it. He read, he collected, he cultivated friendships with the small group of European and American writers, scholars, and diplomats who passed through Peking in those years. Catherine, his wife, was a woman of warmth and curiosity and considerable patience. She and Wallis became, in those Peking months, friends who understood each other without needing to explain. Catherine had grown up wealthy in a way Wallis had not, but she had a kind of humility that money did not always produce, and she liked Wallis immediately, and she made the Rogers household a place where Wallis was not a guest, but, very quickly, a member of the daily rhythm of the house. For nearly a year, Wallis lived in Peking with the Rogerses as if she were their adopted sister. She accompanied them to dinners at the legations. She joined them on excursions to the western hills outside the city, where the old temples sat in their pine forests, and the air was cooler than in town, and the sound of bells came drifting down from the monasteries. She attended the great spring festival celebrations in the old imperial city. She learned the protocols of expatriate Peking life, the right tones to use with the Chinese house staff, the right hours for visits, the right registers for conversation at the official receptions. She also, in this Peking year, did something that her later detractors would never quite acknowledge. She read. She paid attention. She took, for the first time in her life, the time to look closely at a culture that was not her own. She began the lifelong interest in Chinese art and decoration that would decades later fill her Paris house with the most particular collection of jade and porcelain and lacquer that her social circle had ever seen. She bought, on the modest budget she had available to her, the first pieces of what would become a small but exquisite private collection. This is the Wallis of Peking that the official biographies tend to skim over, because it is a slightly inconvenient version. The popular legend wants her to have been doing something exotic and lurid in those Asian months. The actual record suggests something quieter and in some ways more impressive. A young American woman recovering from a difficult marriage, recovering from the slow erosion of her early 20s, made use of an unexpected year and a half abroad to develop the cultural and aesthetic interests that would define the rest of her life. She did, of course, also have a social life that was not all temples and porcelain. She was 30 years old, single in everything but the legal sense, and surrounded by a community of unmarried Western men in their 20s and 30s. There were, the historical record makes clear, flirtations. There were attentive young diplomats. There were dinners that ended with someone walking her home through the moonlit alleys. She was a young woman, in a strange and beautiful place, with the time and the inclination to enjoy herself for the first time in years. But the dark legends about her Peking life, the ones that would later be used to explain her hold over a king, are not supported by anything that the careful historians have found. She was, in those months, simply a young woman quietly recovering and quietly preparing for whatever came next. She also, according to the rumour that would attach itself to her name decades later, did something else, something that would be whispered about in London drawing rooms in the late 1930s, written about in lurid intelligence reports of dubious provenance, and repeated in popular books for the rest of the 20th century. The rumour was that Wallis, during her time in China, had received instruction in certain intimate arts that she would later, the story went, use to bind a king to her so completely that he would give up his throne rather than lose her. The story was called, in some quarters, the China Dossier. It was supposedly compiled by British intelligence in the 1930s. It was supposedly the reason the British government was so determined to prevent her marriage to Edward. The historians who have looked seriously for this dossier, and several have looked very seriously, have not found it. The most thorough investigations of British intelligence files of the period have turned up no such document. The various claims about its contents trace back, in nearly every case, to the same handful of sources, none of them contemporary, all of them written after the abdication, when the appetite for any explanation, however salacious, of how this American woman had brought down a king was at its peak. I mention the legend not to repeat it, but to point out something interesting about it. Look at what the legend is doing. It is taking a fact that is, in its plain form, fairly straightforward. An American woman left her difficult husband, travelled in Asia for a year and a half, returned home, and got on with her life, and turning it into something exotic and sinister. Why? Because the plain fact does not explain what came later. The plain fact does not explain why a king gave up his throne, so the legend invents a cause that feels more proportionate to the effect. This is something we are going to keep running into across this story. The need to explain Wallis as a sorceress, a manipulator, a foreign influence, an exotic threat, because the alternative explanation that she was simply a clever, watchful, attentive American woman who had learned, very young, how to make men feel listened to, is somehow not enough. It was enough. It was always enough. The China years were not training in dark arts. They were a year and a half in which a young woman recovered from a terrible marriage, found her feet on her own for the first time in her adult life, and developed the social confidence that would carry her through everything that came afterwards. She came home to America in the late summer of 1925. She filed for divorce from Win Spencer. The divorce was finalized in December of 1927 in Warrenton, Virginia, where the residency requirements were the most lenient in the country. She was, at that point, 31 years old, divorced, with no money of her own, and with her market value, by every conventional measure, badly diminished. And it was at exactly this moment, in the autumn of 1927, that she met Ernest Simpson. Ernest Aldrich Simpson was in almost every way the opposite of Win Spencer. Where Win had been theatrical and reckless, Ernest was steady and conventional. Where Win had been an aviator, Ernest was a shipping broker. Where Win had been difficult, Ernest was famously gentle. He was 30 years old when Wallis met him, half American and half British, with a face that nobody ever described as handsome, but that almost everybody described as kind. He was also, at the time of their meeting, married to a woman named Dorothea, with whom he had a young daughter. The marriage, by his own account, was not a happy one. He and Dorothea had been growing apart for years. The introduction to Wallis, through mutual friends in New York, came at a moment when he was already, quietly, considering his options. Wallis and Ernest courted carefully. He divorced Dorothea. She finalized her divorce from Win. They married in London on the 21st of July 1928, in a registry office ceremony. Wallis was 32. Ernest was 31. They moved into a flat at Bryanston Court, a respectable building near Marble Arch in London. Ernest joined his father's shipping firm. Wallis set herself with the focus and determination of a woman who has been given one last chance to building a life. I want to spend a moment on what she built, because it matters. By the standards of London society in 1928, Wallis Simpson should have been a non-event. An American, twice married, no money beyond her husband's modest salary, no title, no family connections in England. She should have been at most a name on a list of Americans living in London, occasionally invited to parties given by other Americans living in London, never quite breaking through into the social world that would have noticed her in her own right. That was not what happened. Within 2 years of her arrival in London, Wallis Simpson had built one of the most talked-about dinner tables in the city. Not the largest, not the grandest, the most talked about. The one you wanted to be invited to, the one where the conversation was sharpest, the food was best, the seating was most carefully thought through, and the hostess paid attention to every guest in a way that left them feeling, even hours after the evening had ended, that they had been somehow especially seen. She did this on a budget that her wealthier guests would have found laughable if she had ever discussed it, which she did not. She did it by spending hours on the planning of every menu. She did it by remembering, with what seemed to her guests like effortless naturalness, what each of them liked to drink, what each of them was working on, what each of them had told her last time about their child or their mother or their book. She did it, in short, by deploying with great skill the tools that the genteelly poor child of Baltimore had developed 30 years earlier as a matter of survival. Let me say something about the conditions that made London in 1928 unusually receptive to a woman like Wallis, because the moment matters as much as the person. The London she walked into was, in those years, in the middle of a long, slow transformation that would not be complete until after the next war. The old aristocratic order, which had governed English social life with absolute confidence before 1914, was still in place, but was no longer entirely confident. The casualties of the Great War had hollowed out the great families. The financial pressures of the post-war years had forced many of them to sell, or at least close, their grandest London houses. The young members of the surviving aristocracy had absorbed, from their service in the war, and from the modern century that was unfolding around them, an appetite for new kinds of social life. They wanted American jazz, they wanted American films, they wanted American friends. This last was particularly important for Wallis. Wealthy, well-connected Americans had been a feature of London life for decades, but the depth of the American presence in the late 1920s was something new. The pound had weakened against the dollar after the war. American money went further than it had a generation before. American newspapers had London bureaus full of energetic young correspondents. American banks had London offices. American shipping firms, like the one Ernest worked for, had London operations. There was, by 1928, an entire substratum of upper-middle-class American life in London, complete with its own clubs and its own restaurants and its own informal social networks that interlaced with the English ones. Wallis began very deliberately to build her position within this American London. She joined the right organizations. She volunteered for the right charity committees. She cultivated, with the focused patience that had served her so well in Baltimore and Pensacola, the friendships that would, over time, place her at the center of the social map. The dinners began with gatherings of Americans. Then the Americans brought their English friends. Then the English friends brought their friends. Within 18 months, the dinner table at Bryanston Court included, on a fairly regular basis, members of the English aristocracy, American diplomatic personnel, journalists from the better London newspapers, the occasional artist or writer who happened to be passing through. What was the actual trick? What was Wallis doing that made these dinners more interesting than the dinners hosted by her wealthier rivals? She invited better than her means. She had, on her dinner table, more interesting people, by a clear margin, than her financial situation should have allowed. She did this through a kind of careful, patient escalation. She would invite one slightly more prominent guest, place them next to a charming and capable companion, ensure that they had a wonderful evening, and then, the next time she entertained, she could mention casually that so-and-so had been at her last dinner and was coming again. The guest list in this way climbed slowly upward. She paid relentless attention to the food. The kitchen at Bryanston Court was the focus of more careful work than any other room in the flat. Wallis had hired a cook of considerable skill. She herself studied recipes, planned menus, tasted everything before it left the kitchen, made adjustments to seasoning and presentation that distinguished a competent dinner from a memorable one. The food at Wallis Simpson's table was, by every account of those who ate it, simply better than the food at her rivals' tables. She controlled the conversation with a delicate hand. She had, from her Baltimore childhood, the gift of remembering what every guest had told her on previous occasions. She used this gift, at her dinners, to seed conversations. She would ask one guest, near the start of the evening, about a project he had mentioned the last time. The guest, flattered, would launch into discussion. Wallis would draw in another guest who, she knew, had something interesting to say on the subject. The conversation would build. By the time the soup was over, the table was animated. By the time the main course arrived, the entire room was engaged in a single, swirling discussion that everyone present would remember as the most interesting evening they had had that month. It was, of course, partly a performance, but it was a performance built on real attentiveness. Wallis was actually interested in the people she met. She actually remembered what they had said. She actually thought, in the days between dinners, about how she might place them next to a guest who would interest them. The performance worked because, underneath, the substance was genuine. By 1930, the Simpsons' flat at Bryanston Court was on the list. By the autumn of that year, Wallis had a small but devoted circle of London friends. By the end of the year, she had been included in a weekend house party at Borough Court, the country home of Thelma, Lady Furness. That is exactly where we are going next. I want you to understand the world Wallis was about to walk into, because if you do not understand it, the meeting at Borough Court will not make sense. England in January of 1931 was a country going through something difficult. The Great Depression had arrived from America the previous year and was settling in to stay. Unemployment was climbing. The pound was under pressure. The political situation was unstable, with a Labour government clinging to power by its fingertips. Around the country in the great industrial cities of the north and the coal-mining valleys of Wales, ordinary people were beginning to suffer in ways that the political establishment did not yet entirely grasp. But the social establishment, the world of country houses and London seasons and shooting parties and weekend gatherings, that world continued. It continued because it had continued for centuries, because the people in it had not yet been forced to consider the possibility that it might stop, and because at the centre of it, gleaming and beloved and apparently indestructible, was a single figure who seemed to many of them to be the future of England itself. His name was Edward. He was the Prince of Wales. He was 36 years old. He was, by general consensus, the most photographed man in the world. I want to take a moment with Edward, because to understand Wallis's story, you have to understand his. They were, in many ways, opposites, whose opposite qualities locked together with an almost mechanical precision. Edward had been born into the absolute centre of everything Wallis had been born outside of. He was the eldest son of the man who would become King George V. He was the heir to the throne of the largest empire in the history of the world. From the moment he was born, on the 23rd of June 1894, almost exactly 2 years before Wallis's birth in Pennsylvania, every detail of his life had been arranged for him by people whose job it was to arrange the details of the life of a future king. He had not, by all accounts, enjoyed it. His father, George V, was a stern, unimaginative, fundamentally decent man who had no idea how to talk to his children. His mother, Queen Mary, was a formal, distant woman who loved her children in her own way but did not believe in showing it. Edward grew up in palaces, surrounded by tutors and equerries and footmen, with very little personal warmth from anyone in his immediate family. What he had, instead, was the public. From the moment he was old enough to be photographed, Edward was photographed. From the moment he was old enough to make public appearances, he made them. By the time he was in his early 20s, after a service in the First World War that had been frustrating to him, because he had been kept away from the actual fighting for political reasons, he had become something the British monarchy had not previously produced. A celebrity prince, a young man whose face was instantly recognizable to every household in the empire, a figure of glamour and modernity who seemed in his casual style and his American friends and his fondness for jazz to embody a future that the older generation was not yet sure it approved of. He toured constantly. Through the 1920s, he made one royal tour after another, to Canada, to Australia, to India, to the United States, to South America, to Africa, to every corner of the empire and beyond. The crowds turned out in numbers that astonished even his courtiers. He shook hands until his arms ached. He smiled until his cheeks were sore. He said the right things mostly, and when he said something slightly off the script, when he commented, for example, that something must be done about the conditions in the Welsh coalfields, the press loved him for it. By 1930, the Prince of Wales was, in the imagination of the British public, a kind of secular saint, modern, sympathetic, glamorous, accessible, the future, the hope, the young face the old monarchy was finally going to wear. But here is what the public did not see behind the photographs, behind the smiles, behind the carefully managed image. Edward was a man in some difficulty. He drank, not as Win Spencer had drunk, but steadily, more than was good for him. He slept badly. He suffered from periods of low mood that his staff worked hard to keep out of the press. He was, by the accounts of those who served him closely, a man who did not particularly want to be king. The endless tours, the endless smiling, the endless public role had ground at him in ways that nobody outside his immediate circle quite understood. He had, also, a pattern with women that worried his family considerably. He pursued, almost exclusively, married women, older married women in unhappy marriages. The pattern had begun in his early 20s and had continued through one mistress after another into his 30s. By 1930, his current attachment was to Thelma Lady Furness, an American-born society beauty who was the wife of a viscount and who had become, over the previous 2 years, his official, unofficial mistress. Thelma was the woman who, in January of 1931, invited Wallis Simpson to a weekend hunting party at her country house. She was the woman who, in welcoming Wallis to that house, set in motion the chain of events that would, 6 years later, end the reign of a king. She did it without the slightest idea that she was doing it. Borough Court was a hunting lodge near Melton Mowbray, in Leicestershire. Thelma's husband, Viscount Furness, used it for the hunting season. The weekend in question, the 10th and 11th of January 1931, was a gathering. The Prince of Wales was the guest of honour. The Simpsons had been invited because Thelma liked Wallis, who had been introduced to her some months earlier through a mutual American friend, and because Ernest, with his half-American, half-English background, was a comfortable kind of guest to add to the table. It was cold, very cold, the sort of January weekend in the English Midlands when the sky stays grey for hours and the wind cuts through every layer of wool. Wallis, who had a heavy cold when she arrived, was not at her best. She was pale, slightly hoarse, and not particularly interested in the ceremonial occasion of being introduced to the heir to the throne. That was the first thing Edward noticed about her. She was not particularly interested in being introduced to him. The exact wording of their first conversation has been recorded slightly differently in different accounts, and the version that has become famous may have been polished in retelling, but the substance is consistent across all the versions. He asked her, by way of talk, whether she missed the comforts of America in this cold English weather. He probably mentioned American central heating. He was making conversation, the prince's standard conversation, the sort of polite question he asked of strangers 100 times a week. She replied that she had hoped, upon being introduced to the Prince of Wales, to be asked something a little more original than that. He stared at her. Whatever he had been expecting in the moment, it was not that. She added, after a pause and with a smile, that every American woman who came to England was asked the same question, and that she had hoped he might do better. He laughed. He laughed properly. The accounts of those nearby agree that Edward, who had been making polite conversation in a slightly bored manner up to that point, suddenly became interested. That is the moment. That is the hinge of the entire story. Not a great romance struck like lightning, not love at first sight. Just a 36-year-old prince, surrounded for his entire life by people who flattered him as a matter of professional and personal habit, encountering a 34-year-old American woman who, partly because she had a cold and partly because she was who she was, had not bothered. She had not bothered. She had said what she actually thought. She had, in the most minor and most exquisitely calibrated way, mocked him. He went home that weekend thinking about her. It is worth pausing on what almost no one in that drawing room understood at the time. Edward had spent his entire adult life surrounded by people who had every incentive to tell him what he wanted to hear. His staff, his friends, his mistresses, the aristocrats who hosted him, the crowds who cheered him, the newspapers who photographed him. Every single relationship in his adult life was at some level structured by the fact that he was the future king and that everyone around him knew it. What Wallis had given him, in that one exchange about central heating, was the experience of being talked to as if he were not the future king, being teased, being lightly mocked, being treated as a man who could be expected to make slightly better conversation and who could be teased when he did not. He had almost certainly not had that experience in 20 years. He invited the Simpsons to dinner the following month, then into a weekend at Fort Belvedere, his beloved private retreat near Windsor, then to another. The pattern of friendship that would slowly become something else had begun. I want to be careful here, because the speed at which this is sometimes told gives the wrong impression. The path from January 1931 to the abdication of December 1936 was not quick. It was nearly 6 years long. For most of those 6 years, Edward and Wallis were friends, then close friends, then very close friends, in a slow, half-acknowledged escalation that even the people in it were not entirely sure they understood. For the first 2 years, until late 1933, Wallis was simply one of a circle of friends Edward had built around himself at Fort Belvedere. The fort, as he called it, was a castellated house on the edge of Windsor Great Park. Edward had been given it by his father in 1929 and had thrown himself into its renovation with a focus he gave to almost nothing else. He gardened there. He cleared the rhododendrons that had overgrown the grounds. He hosted weekend parties for friends, where the dress was casual, the conversation was relaxed, and the crushing formality of his official life was set aside. Wallis became a regular at these weekends. Ernest came too at first. He was a perfectly pleasant guest, comfortable in upper-class English company, willing to discuss whatever needed to be discussed. The four of them, Edward, Thelma, Wallis, and Ernest, formed a kind of social square, with Thelma still the official mistress and Wallis still the visiting friend. I want to spend a moment on those Fort Belvedere weekends, because they are the slow, almost imperceptible engine of the whole story, and because most accounts skip past them in a hurry to get to the abdication. The weekends ran on a particular rhythm. The guests would arrive on Friday afternoon or evening, usually by car from London. They would be settled into bedrooms that Edward had renovated with a level of personal attention that none of his other staff could quite explain. He cared, in a way that he cared about almost nothing else in his life, about the details of his guests' comfort. The bed linens were the best he could obtain. The bathrooms had been modernized to a standard that was, by 1932, well ahead of most country houses in England. The vases in the rooms had fresh flowers from the fort's own gardens, arranged by Edward himself if he had time, by his housekeeper if he did not. The first evening was always informal, drinks before dinner, then a dinner, perhaps 8 people around the table, with the dress what Edward called country casual, which meant that the men did not have to wear tails and the women did not have to wear evening gowns. Edward, as the host, set the tone. He was relaxed, attentive, slightly sentimental. He told stories about his travels. He played records on his gramophone. He drank, but not, in those fort weekends, to excess. Saturday was for the gardens. Edward had developed in his 30s a passion for gardening that was, by every account of those who knew him, completely real. He had reclaimed the grounds of the fort from decades of neglect. He had cleared the great drifts of rhododendron that had overgrown the lawn and the slopes leading down to the lake. He had planted new specimen trees, restored the old herbaceous borders, redesigned the kitchen garden to produce vegetables for the house. He worked on the gardens himself with his own hands in old corduroy trousers and a battered pullover. He took his guests on long walks around the grounds, explaining what he had done, what he was planning to do, why one species of magnolia was preferable to another in this particular soil. Wallis, who had no particular interest in gardening, listened. She listened with the focused attention that was her gift. She asked questions. She remembered from one weekend to the next which trees he had been planning to plant. She noticed when something he had been worried about had improved. She made him feel, in the way she had made men feel in Pensacola and London, that what he was doing mattered, that someone outside his own head was paying attention. This is, I think, the thing that the Fort Belvedere weekends gave Edward that he had never had anywhere else in his life. Not the company of a beautiful woman, although Wallis was attractive in her angular, definite way. Not the flirtation of a clever guest, although Wallis was certainly clever. What the weekends gave him was the experience of being, for 2.5 days at a time, treated as a man with a project, a man whose interests were taken seriously, a man whose work, even the private work of gardening, was acknowledged. The afternoons were for activities, sometimes shooting, sometimes riding, sometimes simply walking along the edge of the lake, watching the swans. The Sundays were for lunch with whichever guests were still there. Then a slow afternoon. Then the gradual departure as the cars began to leave for London. Wallis was at most of these weekends from the autumn of 1931 onwards. By the spring of 1932, she was at almost all of them. By the autumn of 1932, Edward was beginning to ask her, between weekends, for her opinion on decisions about the fort. Should he move the dining room curtains? Did she think the new gardener was working out? Was the housekeeper as efficient as she had been a year ago? These were not, on the surface, important questions. They were, in their way, the most important questions of all. Edward was, in asking them, including Wallis in the daily fabric of his domestic life. He was treating her, in those moments, the way a man treats a wife. He had not yet thought of it that way. Neither, perhaps, had she. But the texture of the relationship was being built, weekend by weekend, in the accumulation of consultations and confidences, until it had taken on a shape that no one in their immediate circle could ignore. It was Thelma herself who, almost unbelievably, dismantled this arrangement. In January of 1934, exactly 3 years after the meeting at Borough Court, Thelma announced that she was going to America for several weeks to visit family. She was preparing to be away, and in the days before her departure, she did something that the rest of her life she would describe with the slow disbelief of a person who has watched themselves hand the keys of their own house to a stranger. She turned to Wallis at one of their last lunches together and asked her, in the casual tone of one friend asking a favour of another, to look after the little man while she was away. The little man was their nickname for the Prince of Wales. "Look after him for me," Thelma said. "Make sure he is not lonely." Wallis said she would. Thelma sailed for America in late January 1934. By the time she returned in March, the change had been made. Edward did not exactly tell her, in so many words, that she had been replaced. He did not need to. The signs were everywhere. The way he avoided her eye, the way Wallis was now seated where Thelma used to be seated, the way, at one notorious dinner shortly after Thelma's return, Edward had reached for the salad plate at the same moment as Wallis, and Wallis had lightly, playfully, slapped his hand for taking too much. The room had gone very quiet for a fraction of a second. No one had ever, in living memory, slapped the hand of the Prince of Wales at his own dinner table, and Edward had laughed and put the salad back, and the room had registered, in that one tiny exchange, that something had fundamentally changed. Thelma did not stay long after that. She left, with a dignity she would not always afterwards be given credit for, within a few weeks. The transfer of authority, the strange unspoken transfer of the position of favourite, was complete. What had happened? I think the simplest way to put it is this. In the absence of Thelma, during the weeks of January and February 1934, Edward and Wallis had spent a great deal of time alone in the relaxed setting of Fort Belvedere weekends, and they had discovered that they liked each other's company more than either of them had quite realised. It was not, at this stage, primarily a romantic transformation. It was a deepening of friendship into something that needed a different name. He had begun to depend on her opinion. He had begun to want her at every dinner, at every weekend, at every event that mattered to him. He had begun, in the way that men in his position sometimes do, to behave as if she were the only person in the room whose presence he was actually aware of. She, for her part, had begun to manage him. That word, manage, is going to do a lot of work throughout the rest of this story, and I want to be careful about it. Wallis did not, in any sinister sense, manipulate Edward. She did not scheme. She did not, by any serious account, set out to capture a king. What she did, partly out of her natural personality, and partly because his personality made it almost impossible not to, was take charge of his domestic environment. She told him to wear that tie rather than this one. She told him that the menu for Saturday's dinner needed adjusting. She told him when he was sulking about something that he was being childish and should stop. She gave him, in other words, the experience of being looked after by a competent woman who treated him as a man rather than as a prince. The staff at Fort Belvedere watched all of this with, at first, amused interest, and then with growing alarm. They had served the prince for years. They had seen mistresses come and go. They had not, before, seen him accept correction from any of them. They had not seen him defer. They had not seen him, in the evening conversation, repeat the opinions of any of them, as if they were now his own. He was doing all of those things with Wallis by the spring of 1934. Among the men who began around this time to express private worry about what was happening were the senior members of his official staff, his private secretary, Alec Harding, his assistant private secretary, Tommy Lascelles, a man of formidable intelligence who had served the royal family for years and who saw earlier than almost anyone what this relationship was going to mean, his equerries, his friends from the war years. They began quietly, in the careful way of British courtiers, to compare notes. None of them said anything to Edward. It would not have helped. What they noticed increasingly was something more troubling than the personal infatuation. They noticed that he was becoming careless. He was leaving the famous red boxes, the locked dispatch boxes that contained the documents of state, sitting unopened on his desk for days at a time. He was missing appointments. He was making decisions in conversation with Wallis that ought to have been made in consultation with his ministers. He was, in the most general sense, allowing his political and constitutional responsibilities to slip in favour of the small, intimate, increasingly private world that revolved around her. This was the situation in 1935. It had been, by this point, almost 2 years since the displacement of Thelma. Wallis was, in everything but name, the central figure in the prince's private life. She was at every weekend. She was at most dinners. She was the woman whose photograph sat on his desk. She was the person he telephoned, the courtiers noted, several times a day, often for no reason except to tell her something small. And Ernest Simpson was still her husband. That fact is one of the strangest features of the whole arrangement, and it is worth pausing on. Ernest knew. By 1935, Ernest had to know. Everyone in their immediate circle knew. The London newspapers, in their quiet way, were beginning to know, but the conventions of upper-class English life in the 1930s were such that, as long as no scandal broke into the public sphere, an arrangement like this could continue indefinitely. Ernest accepted the situation, more or less. He continued to live with Wallis at Bryanston Court when she was not at Fort Belvedere. He attended the dinners at the fort when he was invited, which was less often as time went on. He behaved in public as if he and his wife were a normal married couple who happened to spend a great deal of time in the company of the Prince of Wales. What he was thinking privately, no one quite knows. He left no diary. He gave no interviews. He was, throughout the entire crisis that followed, a model of discretion in a story that involved very little of it from anyone else. The closest he came to expressing himself was much later, after everything had ended, when he remarked privately to a friend that he had loved Wallis very much, and that it had broken his heart to lose her. He said it once. He never said it again. The year 1935 deserves a closer look, because it was the year in which the relationship moved from being a private arrangement that the senior figures of British public life could pretend not to notice to being a private arrangement that they could no longer plausibly ignore. In January of 1935, the Silver Jubilee year of King George V began. The country was preparing to celebrate 25 years of the King's reign. There would be processions, there would be services at St. Paul's, there would be tours by the various members of the royal family. designed to bring the celebration to every corner of the empire. Edward, as the Prince of Wales, was at the centre of much of the planning. He attended endless meetings about the form of the celebrations. He gave speeches at the various commemorative events. He performed the ceremonial role he had been performing for nearly 20 years. In every photograph from those Jubilee months, Edward is at the centre, his face composed into the famous Prince of Wales smile. In every photograph he is also, by the testimony of those who watched him closely, slightly elsewhere. He is somewhere else in his head. He is thinking, the people who knew him said, about Wallis. Wallis, in those Jubilee months, was at his side at every private occasion. The Fort Belvedere weekends continued. The dinners in London continued. The telephone calls, several times a day, continued. Edward had begun, in early 1935, to give her jewels of a quality that drew the notice of even the senior members of his household. He had begun to introduce her to visiting heads of state. He had begun, at official events where she could not be present, to mention her in conversation with a casual frequency that to anyone listening carefully was a tell. The senior courtiers had taken this in. They had compared notes. They had, by the spring of 1935, begun to consult, very quietly, about what might be done. The first formal step was a memorandum from one of the senior secretaries to the Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin. The memorandum, dated to the late spring of 1935, described in careful, neutral, civil service prose the situation that had developed over the previous year. The Prince of Wales was, the memorandum stated, in a relationship of considerable intensity with Mrs. Wallis Simpson, an American, twice married, currently in the process of considering divorce from her current husband. The relationship was, by all internal accounts, the most significant in the prince's adult life. There was no indication that the prince intended to bring the relationship to a conventional resolution. There was, however, every indication that he intended, at some point, to make it permanent. The memorandum did not call for any particular action. It simply, in the careful manner of British civil service communication, established a record. The senior figures of the state were now formally aware of the situation. Whatever happened next could not be characterized as a surprise. Through the summer and autumn of 1935, the situation continued without resolution. The king's health declined. Edward's relationship with Wallis intensified. The senior courtiers and politicians watched and waited and prepared in the back rooms of Whitehall for whatever was coming. It came faster than they had expected. By the autumn of 1935, the situation was becoming impossible. Edward was 41 years old. His father, the king, was in his 71st year, and although he was still on the throne, his health was visibly failing. The question of what would happen when George V died, the question of whether Edward as king could plausibly continue an arrangement of this kind, the question of whether the Church of England, of which he would become supreme governor, could tolerate a king whose closest companion was another man's wife. This question was beginning to be discussed, in low voices in the offices and clubs and dining rooms where the senior figures of British public life talked to each other. The discussions were not yet urgent. The king might recover. The relationship might cool. Wallis might tire of Edward, or Edward of Wallis. Many things might still happen. But the king did not recover. That is exactly where we are going next. George V had been on the throne for 25 years. He had come to it in 1910, on the death of his father Edward VII, and he had ruled through the First World War, through the Irish crisis, through the general strike of 1926, through the Great Depression. He was, by the autumn of 1935, a tired man. He suffered from chronic bronchitis. He smoked too much. He had never fully recovered from a near-fatal illness in 1928. By Christmas of 1935, he was visibly declining, and the country, watching him through the radio broadcast he made on Christmas Day, sensed that they might not hear his voice again. He retreated to Sandringham, his country house in Norfolk, in the early days of January 1936. The household around him knew the end was coming. His wife, Queen Mary, sat with him. His doctors hovered. The political situation was managed quietly. The prince at Fort Belvedere was kept informed. On the evening of the 20th of January 1936, the King's doctor, Lord Dawson, made a decision that has haunted British medical ethics ever since. He determined that the king was within hours of death and that, in his judgment, it would be appropriate to hasten the inevitable, both to spare the king any further suffering and to ensure that the announcement of his death would make the morning edition of the Times rather than the less dignified afternoon papers. He administered a fatal dose of morphine and cocaine. The king, who was already unconscious, slipped away peacefully shortly before midnight. The news was announced in the early hours of the 21st of January 1936. Edward at Sandringham at the bedside became, in that instant, King Edward VIII of the United Kingdom and the Dominions, Emperor of India, Defender of the Faith. He was 41 years old. The accession should have been a moment of stately, considered transition. It was not. Almost from the first hours, the new king began to behave in ways that disturbed the people whose job it was to manage royal occasions. The first incident was small, but, in retrospect, telling. The formal proclamation of the new king, the ceremonial reading of his accession by the Garter King of Arms at St. James's Palace, took place on the 22nd of January. Edward, as the new king, was not required to attend. By tradition, he did not. The proclamation was made on his behalf in his absence, but Edward attended anyway. He stood at a window inside St. James's Palace, looking down on the proclamation in the courtyard below, and beside him, watching with him, stood Wallis Simpson. Several courtiers noticed it. Several diplomats noticed it. The Bishop of Worcester, who happened to glance up at the window during the ceremony, saw the new king standing there with a woman who was clearly not his sister, his mother, or any other figure who could conventionally have been beside him. The bishop did not know who the woman was. Later that day, when he learned, he wrote in his diary that he was deeply troubled. The new king had appeared at his own proclamation in the company of his mistress. It was a breach of protocol, but it was a breach that signalled to the people watching for such signals that the new reign was going to be different. Wallis herself, in the weeks that followed, wrote to her Aunt Bessie Merriman in Washington a series of letters that historians have spent decades pondering. The letters are remarkable for what they do not say as much as for what they say. They describe parties, they describe dresses, they describe the social details of a life that had become, almost overnight, the most observed life in London. They mention the king with a kind of careful affection. They do not anywhere describe what Wallis thought was going to happen. The historians who have studied these letters tend to come away with a particular impression. Whatever Wallis was, she does not seem, in the spring of 1936, to have been a woman who was confidently planning her own coronation. The tone is not triumphant. It is, if anything, slightly bewildered. She uses phrases like, "I do not know and we shall see," and these things have a way of working themselves out. She seems, reading her own words, like a woman who has been carried into a situation she did not entirely choose, and who is not yet sure how she is going to get out of it. This is one of the points where the conventional version of the story really begins to fall apart. The conventional version says that Wallis Simpson, an ambitious American adventuress, set out to capture a king, and, when the throne fell into her lap in January 1936, made her move. The letters do not support this. The letters suggest a woman who is genuinely uncertain, occasionally frightened, aware that she is on a track she cannot easily step off, and not at all confident that the track leads anywhere good Edward, by contrast, had decided. Whatever Wallis was thinking in the spring of 1936, Edward had made up his mind. He intended to marry her. He had not yet told anyone whose opinion mattered that this was what he intended, but he had, in his own private working through of the matter, settled the question. He did not mention it to his mother, Queen Mary, who was now the Dowager Queen and a woman of formidable conventional moral views. He did not mention it to his brothers, particularly to his next youngest brother Albert, who was the Duke of York, and who was therefore, in the absence of any children of Edward, the heir to the throne. He did not mention it to his Prime Minister Stanley Baldwin, who had returned to office in 1935 after a brief retirement, and who was, at 68, a man with very little appetite for constitutional dramas. Edward did not mention it to any of them because, on some level, he knew exactly what they would say. He preferred, for as long as possible, not to hear it. What he did do through the spring and summer of 1936 was conduct his new role in a way that made the senior figures of the British state more and more uneasy. He continued to leave the red boxes unread. He continued to telephone Wallis several times a day. He continued to invite her, openly now, to every dinner and every weekend. He gave her jewels. He gave her, in fact, a quite remarkable amount of jewels, drawn partly from his own collection and partly from purchases that were increasingly beginning to attract notice. The most notorious was a piece called the Cartier ruby and diamond bracelet, which he gave her for her 40th birthday in June of 1936. The bill for it was substantial enough that the courtiers who saw it shook their heads. The senior civil servants and the Prime Minister, watching all of this, began to coordinate. They began to share information. They began to compile, in the careful, methodical way of British government, a picture of what was actually happening in the King's private life. By midsummer of 1936, the picture they had compiled was clear. The King was, in everything but the legal sense, living with a married woman. He intended to marry her as soon as her divorce could be arranged, and he had given no sign that he understood, or that he was willing to consider, the constitutional implications of what he was planning. The constitutional implications were these. The King was, by his coronation oath, the supreme governor of the Church of England. The Church of England in 1936 did not permit the remarriage of divorced persons whose former spouses were still living. Wallis, if she divorced Ernest Simpson, would have not one but two living former spouses. The notion that the Supreme Governor of the Church of England could marry such a woman was, in the considered view of every senior bishop and every senior politician who looked at the question, simply impossible. There was also the matter of the dominions. The empire was held together by 1936, partly by the shared person of the sovereign. The King of Britain was also the King of Canada, the King of Australia, the King of New Zealand, the King of South Africa. Any decision about the King's marriage was not Britain's decision alone. It was a decision that had to be ratified in some form by every Dominion government. And the early soundings, conducted very quietly through the summer and autumn of 1936, suggested that no Dominion government was going to ratify a marriage to a twice-divorced American woman. This was the situation, the fully established constitutional situation, that hung over the summer of 1936 like a thundercloud that no one would quite name. And in August of 1936, Edward took Wallis on holiday, not just any holiday, a cruise. He chartered a luxury yacht called the Nalin. He filled it with friends. He made, as the central figure of the entire holiday, the very visible companion who was at this point almost certainly the most photographed unmarried woman in the world. Let me give you a sense of what this cruise actually looked like, because the photographs that came out of it changed the public discourse in every country except Britain, and that mattered enormously for what came next. The plan, as Edward had originally conceived it, was to spend the holiday quietly. He would charter a yacht. He would invite a circle of friends. He would sail through some of the most beautiful waters in Europe, swim, sunbathe, eat well, and emerge in early September refreshed for the autumn's responsibilities. The relationship with Wallis, which by August of 1936 was the central fact of his private life, would simply, by being unmentioned, be allowed to continue at its existing tempo. Almost everything about this plan went wrong. The yacht itself, the Nalin, was about as inconspicuous as a battleship. She was nearly 300 feet long. She had been built for holiday making that the very wealthy of that era considered appropriate. She had cabins for many guests, a substantial crew, a fleet of motor launches stowed on her deck, and a level of polished brass and white paint that made her, at every port of call, instantly identifiable as something extraordinary. The party Edward invited included friends, equerries, a staff, and Wallis. There were perhaps a dozen guests in all. The composition was a peculiar one, the sort of mixture that occurs when a host is trying to assemble a holiday that looks innocent on paper while secretly being structured around a single relationship that cannot be acknowledged. Wallis was the only woman present without her husband. Ernest had been pointedly not invited. The other women on the cruise were married, with their husbands present, and their job, although none of them ever quite admitted this, was to provide the social cover that allowed Wallis to be there in apparently respectable company. The cover did not hold for 15 minutes after the yacht sailed. The first port of call was on the Adriatic coast of what was then Yugoslavia. Edward had arranged, through diplomatic channels, for the visit to be informal. There would be no official reception. There would be no ceremonial greeting. He would, the British embassy in Belgrade had been told, simply be a private gentleman on a private holiday. The Yugoslav authorities had other ideas. The arrival of the King of England on the Yugoslav coast was, for them, a major diplomatic event. Crowds had been organised, bands had been arranged, local officials in their best uniforms were waiting on the dock. When the Narlin came into harbour, the Adriatic town turned out almost in its entirety to see the King of England step ashore. He stepped ashore, and Wallis stepped ashore beside him, and the photographers began to work, and within an hour the photographs were on their way to the wire services in Belgrade and Vienna, and Paris and London. This pattern repeated, with variations, at every port of call over the next 4 weeks. Dubrovnik, Split, Kotor, Corfu, Athens, the Dardanelles, Istanbul. Each time the local population turned out in greater numbers. Each time the photographers got better positions. Each time the photographs that emerged showed more and more unmistakably that the King of England was on holiday with a woman who was not his wife, and who, by every indication of her behaviour and his, was nevertheless the central person on his cruise. The most photographed moments were not the formal ones. They were the private moments that the photographers, working with the long lenses that were just becoming available in the mid-1930s, could capture from the dockside or from a passing motorboat. Edward, in shorts and a polo shirt, helping Wallis into a launch. Wallis, in a sun hat, leaning against a railing while Edward, behind her, said something that was making her laugh. The two of them, walking together through a Greek market, his arms slightly around her shoulders. 100 photographs, from 100 different angles, all of them telling the same story. There was one episode, in early August, that made its way into almost every American paper. Edward and Wallis had gone ashore at one of the smaller Adriatic ports. They had walked through the small town. At some point, Wallis had grown irritated about something, perhaps the heat, perhaps a question Edward had asked her, perhaps simply the cumulative pressure of being photographed for the 3rd week in a row. Whatever the cause, the photographers caught a moment when she had clearly snapped at him. The picture shows her speaking sharply, her hand raised, and Edward looking at her with an expression that the American papers, when they ran the picture, captioned with something like "The King takes correction." That picture, more than any other from the cruise, made the rounds. It made the rounds because it showed something that was, to the world at large, unbelievable. The King of England, the defender of the faith, the most photographed man on earth, being scolded in public by a Baltimore divorcee. It became in the American press a kind of running joke. Mrs. Simpson disciplines the king. Mrs. Simpson tells His Majesty what's what. The British public did not see these pictures. The British press, by the gentleman's agreement that was still holding in August of 1936, ran nothing about the cruise except occasional brief mentions that the king was on holiday. But the photographs and the stories were everywhere else, and a certain proportion of the British public, those who travelled, those who had relatives abroad, those who had access to American magazines through the better London bookshops, were beginning to know, when the Narlin returned to harbour at the end of August, the shape of the autumn was already being set. Edward returned to his official duties as king. Wallis returned to London. The senior officials of the British state, who had spent the previous month in increasingly worried meetings about the implications of what was now unmistakably visible in every newspaper outside Britain, began to prepare for what they could see was coming. The Narlin sailed from Yugoslavia, down the Dalmatian coast, through the Greek islands, into the eastern Mediterranean. The route was supposed to be informal. It was not. At every port, crowds gathered to see the King of England on holiday. At every appearance, photographers were there to record him. And what they recorded, in photograph after photograph after photograph, was not the King of England on holiday with friends. It was the King of England on holiday with a woman, the same woman, photographed beside him in casual clothes, in swimwear, in restaurants, in markets, in every setting where two people who are visibly together would be photographed. The American press carried it. The American press carried it on the front page every day for weeks. The headlines were not subtle. King's romance with Mrs. Simpson. King and Mrs. Simpson stroll through Yugoslav village. King's American friend joins royal cruise. The photographs, dozens and dozens of them, showed exactly what had been an open secret in London for 2 years. The French press carried it. The German press carried it. The Italian press carried it. The British press, by an extraordinary gentleman's agreement among the press barons, carried nothing. This is one of the most remarkable features of the entire crisis, and it deserves a moment. The press barons of 1936, principally Lord Beaverbrook, who owned the Express, and Lord Rothermere, who owned the Mail, had agreed informally among themselves that the King's relationship with Mrs. Simpson would not be reported in the British press. They had agreed this for a mixture of reasons: personal loyalty to the King, in some cases, a sense of the dignity of the throne, a worry about what the public reaction would be if the story broke, a genuine old-fashioned belief that there were some matters that simply ought not to be reported. Whatever the mixture of reasons, the agreement held. Through the summer of 1936, while photographs of the King and Mrs. Simpson on the Narlin filled the front pages of newspapers from New York to Berlin, the British public read about the King's holiday in tones of perfect, careful, absolute discretion. 2 paragraphs about the cruise, no photographs of his companion, no mention of her by name. The British public, as the autumn of 1936 began, knew almost nothing about the situation that had been the talk of every drawing room in London for 2 years. That was about to change. On the 27th of October, 1936, a hearing was held at the Ipswich Assizes in Suffolk. It was a divorce hearing. The petitioner was Mrs. Wallis Simpson. The respondent was her husband, Mr. Ernest Simpson. The grounds were adultery, which Ernest had supposedly committed at the Hotel de Paris in Bray with a woman who was named in the proceedings as Mrs. Buttercup Kennedy. The whole thing was a fiction. Ernest had agreed to provide the evidence for the divorce as a courtesy to his wife and to the King. Mrs. Buttercup Kennedy was a friend of his who had agreed to be photographed with him in a hotel room for the purpose. The hearing, held at a quiet provincial assize court, chosen specifically because it was off the radar of the London press, lasted about 20 minutes. The decree nisi, the preliminary order of divorce, was granted. The decree absolute, which would actually finalise the divorce, would follow in 6 months, in late April of 1937. The hearing was reported in the Times and a few other papers in tones of complete neutrality. Mrs. Simpson divorces husband. No mention of the King. No mention of Fort Belvedere. No mention of the cruise. The British press blackout was still holding, but it was about to break. The wider world, particularly the American press, immediately understood what the divorce hearing meant. If Wallis Simpson would be free to remarry on the 27th of April 1937, and if the King of England planned to be crowned on the 12th of May 1937, then the King of England was clearly planning to marry her in the 2-week window between those dates, and to be crowned with her at his side. That was the story. That was undeniably what the situation now was. The British press blackout could not hold against that. It held, remarkably, for 6 more weeks. Through all of November of 1936, the British public read nothing about the developing crisis, while every other newspaper in the Western world wrote about almost nothing else. The senior politicians knew, the senior civil servants knew, the senior clergymen knew, the senior aristocrats knew. The British public, going about its November business, did not behind the scenes, however. The senior figures of the state were having the most consequential series of conversations in modern British political history. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, had requested an audience with the King on the 16th of November. The audience took place at Buckingham Palace. It lasted, by Baldwin's later account, about an hour and 40 minutes. It was, on Baldwin's side, the most difficult conversation of his political career. He told the King, with the gentleness and the clarity that were his trademarks, that the situation could not continue. The country, when it learned of the relationship, would not accept Mrs. Simpson as Queen. The Dominions, when they learned, would not accept her either. The Church of England, of which the King was supreme governor, would not solemnize such a marriage. There were 3 options, Baldwin said. The King could give up Mrs. Simpson. The King could marry her against the advice of his ministers, in which case the government would resign, and a constitutional crisis of unpredictable severity would follow, or the King could abdicate. The King listened. The King said he would think about it. The King in fact had already made up his mind, and Baldwin, who had served 3 monarchs and who could read a man's face after 30 years in politics, knew it. Baldwin returned to Downing Street and informed the senior members of his cabinet of what had been said. The cabinet began, that evening, the careful work of preparing for what was now clearly coming. During the same days, Wallis was in London at Bryanston Court, occasionally at Fort Belvedere, in a state that her closest friends remember as one of growing alarm. She had begun, by the 3rd week of November, to understand what was actually happening. She had begun to grasp that the situation was no longer one in which she could plausibly claim, as she had been claiming for 2 years, that her relationship with the King was an essentially private matter that had no necessary public consequences. She had begun, in the way that people in slowly developing crises do, to look for an exit and find that the doors had been locked. She tried to talk to Edward. She tried, in the long evening conversations at the fort, to suggest that perhaps they should reconsider, that perhaps marriage was not, after all, the right outcome, that perhaps the relationship could continue in some less formal way. Edward, by these last weeks of November, would not entertain any such suggestion. He had, in his own private working through, settled the matter. They would marry. He would, if necessary, abdicate. There was nothing more to discuss. The senior figures of the press establishment, who by this point knew everything that the politicians knew, were holding a series of nervous meetings of their own. Lord Beaverbrook of the Express had been asked, personally and directly, by Edward to maintain the press blackout for as long as possible. Beaverbrook had agreed. Lord Rothermere of the Mail had been asked the same and had agreed the same. The other major papers, taking their lead from Beaverbrook and Rothermere, had also agreed. The agreement was holding, but every editor in London understood that it could not hold indefinitely. Some event, some statement, some accidental disclosure would break the silence. The question was only when. The break came, when it came, from an unexpected direction. On the 1st of December 1936, Dr. Alfred Blunt, the Bishop of Bradford, gave a sermon at his diocesan conference. The sermon was about the upcoming coronation. In it, the bishop made some general remarks about the spiritual responsibilities of the king, and expressed the wish that His Majesty might be more conscious of the religious dimensions of his role. The bishop was, in fact, talking about the king's general lack of church-going and not specifically about Mrs. Simpson. He had not, by his own later account, been thinking about Mrs. Simpson at all, but the press, hungry for any peg on which to hang the story they had been forbidden to tell, took the bishop's mild remark and used it. By the morning of the 3rd of December, the Yorkshire Post had run a piece interpreting the bishop's sermon as a coded reference to the king's relationship with Mrs. Simpson. By the afternoon, every newspaper in Britain had picked it up. By the evening, the country was reading for the first time the story that everyone in London had known for 2 years. The reaction was, by every account, electric. Within 48 hours, the country was in a state that the older politicians compared to the worst weeks of 1914. There were crowds outside Buckingham Palace. There were crowds outside Downing Street. There were crowds outside the offices of every newspaper. Telegrams flooded in to members of Parliament. The country, having been told nothing about the situation for 2 years, was now being asked, all at once, to form a view on whether the king should marry an American divorcee. Wallis, on the 3rd of December, was in her flat at Bryanston Court when the press broke. The crowds gathered outside within hours. By that evening, photographers were camped at every entrance. She could not leave the building. She could not go anywhere without being followed. The flat became, almost overnight, a kind of siege. That night, Edward telephoned her. He told her she had to leave London. He told her he would arrange a car and a party of friends to drive her to France. He told her, in the gentle and slightly breathless way he tended to use when he was at his most determined, that he would handle everything. She left Bryanston Court that night, in the back seat of a car, lying down so the photographers could not see her. She was driven to Newhaven, where a ferry took her across the Channel. She drove south through France, accompanied by an old friend, Lord Brownlow, and arrived 4 days later at the Villa VIII, the home of her old friends Catherine and Herman Rogers, in the hills above Cannes. The journey itself was an ordeal. Lord Brownlow, the friend Edward had asked to accompany Wallis, was a steady, decent, slightly lugubrious man who had been completely unprepared for the role he was now playing. He was driving a woman he barely knew in a borrowed car through the dark roads of northern France in early December, with a press pack behind them that had picked up their trail at Dieppe, and that was now, in considerable numbers, in pursuit. They drove through the night. They stopped at French country hotels for a few hours of sleep, only to be woken at dawn by the sound of cameras outside the windows. They changed cars twice, hoping to throw the photographers off. They did not entirely succeed. By the time they reached the south of France, they had been pursued, photographed, and shouted at across nearly 700 miles of French roads. Louviers, when they arrived, was a refuge. The Rogerses had been preparing for Wallis's arrival since the evening of the 3rd, when Edward had telephoned Herman from Fort Belvedere to ask whether his old friends would take her in. They had said yes immediately, of course. They had also, in the days before her arrival, arranged for the gates of the property to be reinforced, and for a small group of local police to be stationed at the entrance to keep the journalists out. The villa itself, perched on the hillside above Cannes with its views over the Mediterranean, was a place that, in normal times, was peaceful. In December of 1936, it became the operational headquarters of a woman trying, against the determination of the King of England, to retreat from a situation that was about to consume both of them. She arrived exhausted. The Rogerses settled her in. She slept, by Catherine's later account, for nearly 12 hours. When she woke, the calls from London began. Edward telephoned every few hours over the days of the 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th of December. The calls lasted, sometimes for 90 minutes. They were heard, partially, by anyone in the villa who happened to walk past the room where Wallis was speaking. What the witnesses at Louviers always said they heard, and what the few surviving documentary fragments tend to confirm, was this. Wallis, on her side of the calls, was begging Edward not to abdicate. She was telling him, in the clear, focused voice that her friends recognized that there had to be another way, that he should consult more people, that he should think about the family, that he should think about the country, that he should above all not make a decision he would spend the rest of his life regretting. Edward, on his side, was implacable. The accounts of the people who could hear his voice through the receiver describe a man who had, by this point, made up his mind so completely that no argument could move him. He did not hear her objections. He did not engage with her alternatives. He simply, in tone after tone, returned to the same fixed point. He would not stay on the throne without her. He would not consider compromise. He would not entertain the possibility that he might continue as king and conduct a relationship with her in some less formal way. The choice was binary, marriage or abdication. He was choosing abdication. The decision was made. Wallis, by the morning of the 7th, had begun to understand that she was not going to be able to change his mind by argument. She made one final attempt by a different route. She drafted, with Lord Brownlow's help, a public statement. She stayed at VIII for the rest of December. She did not see Edward again until after the abdication. The most consequential decision of his life, and of hers, was made in their separate locations, communicating only by telephone, while half the world watched. I want to spend some time on this period, the first 10 days of December 1936, because it is the heart of the whole story, and because almost nothing about the popular version of it is correct. The popular version says that Wallis, having captured the king, refused to release him, that she insisted on marriage, that she was willing to see him give up the throne so long as she could have him. The actual record says something quite different. What Wallis did from the moment she arrived at VIII was tell Edward to stay on the throne. She told him on the telephone repeatedly in calls that lasted hours, and that the household at VIII could not help overhearing. She told him that he must not give up his throne for her. She told him that they could continue, somehow, after his coronation, as they had before. She told him that if necessary she would withdraw entirely, would disappear from his life, would do whatever was needed to allow him to remain king. On the 7th of December, she went further. She issued, from VIII, a public statement. It was distributed to the press through Lord Brownlow. It said, in language that was carefully drafted but clearly her own intention, that she had been willing throughout the previous weeks, and remained willing, to withdraw from a situation that had become both unhappy and untenable. The statement was real. The willingness was real. By every account of the people at VIII in those days, including the testimony of Herman Rogers, who knew her better than almost anyone, she was not pretending. She was genuinely trying to find a way out. Edward refused. He refused in a series of telephone conversations during the 2nd week of December that the people at Fort Belvedere, who could hear his side of them, found almost unbearable to witness. He told her he would not stay on the throne without her. He told her that if she withdrew, he would abdicate anyway. He told her, in language that has been variously reported, that there was no version of his life that did not include her, and that if the choice was between the throne and her, the choice was already made. It is worth pausing to think about what that meant. Edward had by this point been king for less than 11 months. He had not been crowned. He had not yet undertaken any of the major ceremonial duties of the office. He was, technically and legally, still in the early phase of his reign, and he was telling the woman he loved that he would give all of it up rather than lose her. Whether that was love or obsession or some combination of the two, the historians will continue to argue about, but it was not, by the documentary record, what Wallis wanted. What Wallis wanted, in those December days, was to find a way to make the situation survivable for both of them. What Edward wanted was a single, total, irrevocable solution. He wanted to abdicate. There was, in the early days of December, one last attempt to avoid it. Edward proposed, through his Prime Minister, what was called a morganatic marriage. A morganatic marriage was a marriage in which the wife of the king did not become queen, and any children did not inherit the throne. It was a continental European concept, used occasionally by Habsburg and Hohenzollern princes who had married women considered beneath them. It had no precedent in British constitutional law. It would have required an Act of Parliament, and it would have required the agreement, again, of every Dominion government. The Prime Minister, Stanley Baldwin, took the proposal seriously enough to consult. The consultation lasted about a week. The answer that came back from the Dominions was unanimous and unambiguous. No, they would not accept a morganatic marriage. They would not accept Wallis as the king's wife in any form. The king must give her up or give up his throne. The cabinet considered the answer. The cabinet endorsed the answer. Stanley Baldwin returned to Edward at Fort Belvedere and told him, in the gentle, considered, devastating manner that was Baldwin's particular gift, that the situation was now what it was. The king had to choose. The king chose on the 10th of December 1936 at Fort Belvedere, in the presence of his 3 brothers. The king signed the instrument of abdication. The document was short. It said, in essence, that he was renouncing the throne for himself and for any descendants he might have. His brother Albert, the Duke of York, would succeed him as king on the evening of the 11th of December 1936. Edward made a radio broadcast from Windsor Castle. It was, by every account, the most listened-to broadcast in the history of British radio up to that point. The country gathered in millions around radio sets in their kitchens and parlours and pubs to hear what their king would say. The arrangements for the broadcast had been made in considerable haste. The BBC had set up its equipment in the Augusta Tower at Windsor Castle, the same tower where Edward had spent many of the private hours of his reign. The technical staff had arrived in the late afternoon. The microphone had been positioned. The wires had been run. By early evening, everything was ready. Edward arrived at the broadcasting room shortly before 10. He was, by the accounts of those present, calm but slightly drawn. He had been working on the text of the broadcast over the previous several days, in consultation with Winston Churchill, who had been, throughout the abdication crisis, one of the few senior political figures who had remained sympathetic to him personally, even as he had advised against the marriage. Churchill had helped him, in the final hours, to find the language that would carry the right emotional weight while not embarrassing his successor or the country. The text, when Edward sat down at the microphone, was 4 pages long. He had marked it up in pencil with notations about pacing and emphasis. He took a sip of water. He glanced at the BBC announcer who would introduce him. The announcer, who had spent his career introducing royal broadcasts, looked back at him with what could only be described as the quiet professional sadness of a man performing the most difficult announcement of his career. The introduction was made. This is Windsor Castle, His Royal Highness Prince Edward, not the King, Prince Edward. He had stopped being king at the moment of the abdication that morning. The form of address itself was a small, sharp reminder of what had happened. He spoke for less than 10 minutes. He said that he had found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge his duties as king as he would wish to do without the help and support of the woman he loved. He said the decision had been his and his alone. He asked the country's understanding. He blessed his brother, the new king, and he ended with a phrase that, whatever else can be said about him, has lasted in the memory of nearly every English-speaking person who has ever heard it. God save the king. Not himself, not the king he had been until that morning, the new king, his brother, Albert, who would now be called George VI. The broadcast ended. The country, listening, did not quite know what to do. Some people wept. Some people went out to find a drink. Some people, including a great many of the older generation, were silently and deeply furious. Some people, particularly the young, felt something like sympathy. Almost everyone felt that they had just witnessed something they had never expected to witness in their lives. In a villa in the south of France, Wallis Simpson listened to the broadcast on the radio. By the accounts of the people with her, she sat absolutely still for the duration of it. When it ended, She did not speak for some time. Then she said, very quietly, that she was tired and that she was going upstairs. Catherine Rogers, who had been beside her on the sofa during the broadcast, told the story afterwards with a kind of measured restraint that suggested how much she had not said. Wallis had not, she said, wept. She had not exclaimed. She had simply sat, with her hands in her lap, and listened. When the broadcast was over, when the announcer had returned and the radio had moved on to whatever program came afterwards, she had stood up, smoothed her dress, and said in her ordinary voice that she would go up. She had walked up the stairs alone. The Rogerses had heard her bedroom door close. They had not heard her cry. They had not heard her speak. They had heard, after a while, the sounds of her preparing for bed. In the morning, when she came down for breakfast, she was, by Catherine's account, exactly as she had been the day before, composed, polite, asking after the household plans for the day. The mask of competent self-control that she had worn for most of her adult life was firmly back in place, and it would, with a few brief lapses, remain there for the rest of her life. What she had felt during those private hours upstairs, on the night the King of England gave up his throne for her, no one ever fully knew. She did not write about it. She did not speak about it. Whatever the broadcast had meant to her, in the privacy of her own response to hearing the man she loved tell the world that he loved her, she kept to herself. The following morning, the man who had been King Edward VIII left Windsor Castle in the back seat of a car. He was driven to Portsmouth, where a destroyer of the Royal Navy carried him across the Channel to France. He arrived at the Austrian estate of friends, where he would remain through the winter and spring of 1937, while the divorce became absolute and the arrangements for his marriage to Wallis were quietly made. Edward and Wallis were now a former king and a soon-to-be divorcee, separated by the entire length of Europe, planning a wedding that the British royal family had already decided would not be attended by any of them. That is exactly where we are going next. The arrangements for the wedding occupied most of the spring of 1937. Wallis, at Louviers in the south of France, was the centre of a household that included, at various points, her old friends, the Rogerses, her Aunt Bessie Merriman, who had travelled out from America, a staff, and an increasingly large detachment of British and French security personnel, sent to keep journalists and curiosity seekers away from the gates. Those months at Louviers were strange ones. Wallis, by some accounts, suffered through them in a state of barely contained anxiety. She had no fixed programme. She could not see Edward. She could not return to England, where she would have been mobbed by photographers and reviled by a press that had now turned firmly against her. She could not return to America, where her presence would have created a different kind of circus. She was stuck in a beautiful villa in the south of France, waiting for the slow legal mechanism of her divorce from Ernest to grind through to its conclusion. She filled the days with letter writing. She wrote to her Aunt Bessie. She wrote to old American friends. She wrote, with increasing frequency, to Edward, who wrote back to her every day, sometimes twice a day, in long, slightly hectic letters that the postman of Cannes and of the Austrian estate came to recognize as a regular fixture of their delivery routes. The letters, which have partially survived, are revealing of where each of them stood by January and February of 1937. Edward's are full of plans. He was thinking, even at this early stage, about the role he wanted to play in European public life as a former king. He was already drafting, in his head, the speeches he would give. He was already imagining, in considerable detail, the houses they would live in. Wallis's letters are quieter. She is, in those letters, not making plans. She is asking how Edward is. She is reporting on her own daily activities. She is writing in the way that a person writes when they are still working through what has happened to them, about the things, the weather, the visitors, the bird she had seen in the garden. She also, during these months, gave a small number of interviews to selected journalists who had been carefully vetted by Lord Brownlow. The interviews were intended to soften her public image. They were not entirely successful. The American journalists, in particular, found her articulate but slightly distant, polished but somehow unreachable, a subject who answered the questions accurately without ever quite letting the interviewer see who she actually was. Edward in Austria was less constrained. He gave dinners, he travelled, he received visitors. He was, by every account of those who saw him during these months, almost manically focused on the future, almost completely unwilling to look back. The abdication was, in his telling, the right decision, the only decision, the decision he had made and would not unmake. The country had failed to accept his choice. He had therefore been forced to make a different choice. The matter was settled. The two of them were reunited, finally, at the Château de Cande in early May. The reunion was, by the few accounts that have survived, emotional. Edward had not seen Wallis for nearly 5 months. He had been telephoning her, writing to her, dreaming about her, and not seeing her for what was, in the rhythm of their relationship, an extraordinarily long absence. When he finally arrived at the chateau, he greeted her with a kind of restrained warmth that suggested, to the few witnesses present, that he had been holding himself in check for the entire journey from Austria. The weeks at Cande before the wedding were a period of careful, slightly anxious preparation. The press were excluded from the grounds, but they were everywhere in the surrounding villages. Every detail of the wedding arrangements was being worked out under conditions of considerable secrecy. The dressmaker for Wallis's wedding gown, the American designer Mainbocher, had to be smuggled in and out of the chateau with the kind of secrecy that, in other circumstances, would have been used for a state visit by a foreign head of government. The staff at the chateau were sworn to silence. The gardener, the housekeeper, the cook, all of them understood that what was happening at the chateau in the spring of 1937 was both extraordinary and confidential. Wallis spent the days writing letters, fitting dresses, walking in the gardens with Edward, and trying, in the brief private moments they had, to begin the slow work of figuring out who they were going to be to each other now that the great crisis was over and the long, ordinary marriage was about to begin. Edward, until the late spring, was at Schloss Enzisfeld, the Austrian castle of his old friend Baron Eugen de Rothschild and his wife Kitty. He had been told, very firmly, by his brother the new king and by the Prime Minister, that he was not welcome to return to Britain until after the wedding had been quietly disposed of and the public attention had moved on. He chafed at this. He had not, in his planning of the abdication, fully grasped that abdication would mean exile. He had imagined, in some fuzzy way, that he would settle in some quiet corner of England, that he and Wallis would live a kind of country gentleman's life, that the family would eventually warm to her, that the whole thing would settle. The family had no intention of letting it settle. Queen Mary, the Dowager Queen, the formidable mother of 2 kings, had taken the abdication harder than almost anyone. She regarded what her eldest son had done as a personal and constitutional betrayal of the most serious kind. She had not approved of Wallis when Edward was prince. She did not approve of her now. She had, in her view, lost a son to a woman who was not worthy of him, and she was not prepared to pretend otherwise. The new king, George VI, who had been Albert until the moment his brother abdicated, was a different kind of man. He was shy. He suffered from a stammer that he had spent his adult life trying to overcome. He had not wanted the throne. He had not been prepared for it. He was, in the spring of 1937, a man who had been thrown into the most demanding job in British public life with no warning, and he was very quietly terrified. What George VI felt about his older brother in the spring of 1937 was a complicated mixture of love, resentment, fear, and slow-burning anger. He had loved Edward as a child. He had admired him as a young man. He had, throughout the abdication crisis itself, behaved with absolute loyalty, never criticizing his brother in public, never hinting at his own ambitions, simply doing what he was told and waiting to see what would happen. But once the throne was actually his, once he had become king, the calculation changed. He was now the head of an institution that his brother had, in his view, almost destroyed. He had to think about the future of that institution. He had to think about his own daughter, the young Princess Elizabeth, who was now, at the age of 10, the heir presumptive. He had to think about what kind of monarchy he was going to leave to her, and he decided in the weeks after the abdication that the best protection for the institution was distance. Distance from Edward, distance from Wallis. A clear, unmistakable public separation between the new monarchy and the previous one. The form this took in the spring of 1937 was a series of decisions about Edward's status as a former king. There would be a title for him. He would be made Duke of Windsor. There would be an income settled in private discussions between the two brothers and their respective lawyers. There would be conditions about where he could live and when he could visit Britain. And there would be one decision made at the very last moment that would poison the relationship between Edward and his family for the rest of his life. The decision concerned the legal style of his future wife. Edward, when he became Duke of Windsor, was restored by letters patent to the style of His Royal Highness. This was the style that, as a former king, he had effectively kept. By every assumption of British constitutional and royal practice, his wife, when he married, would automatically share that style. She would be Her Royal Highness the Duchess of Windsor. In the late spring of 1937, just before the wedding, the new king issued letters patent on the advice of the Prime Minister. The letters patent specifically excluded Edward's wife from sharing his royal style. She would be the Duchess of Windsor. She would not be Her Royal Highness. She would be, in the legal phrasing of the document, the only wife of a British duke in history not entitled to her husband's rank. The decision was made for reasons that the government and the new king felt were sound. They worried that if Wallis were granted the style of Royal Highness, she could not afterwards be deprived of it, and that any future divorce would create a Royal Highness in circumstances even more embarrassing than her current ones. They worried about the precedent. They worried about what the dominions, which had to be consulted on every detail, would tolerate. Edward, when he heard about the decision, was incandescent. He was, by every account of those around him, more deeply wounded by this than by any other aspect of the abdication. The throne he had, in his own mind, willingly given up. The exile he had accepted. The family's coldness toward Wallis he had, more or less, expected. But this legal decision about 3 letters of style struck him as a deliberate, calculated, personal cruelty. He fought it for the rest of his life. He insisted that his staff address Wallis as Your Royal Highness in private. He took every formal title for himself with the explicit understanding that his wife had been deliberately and personally denied the matching one. He raged in letters to his brother, in conversations with friends, in interviews late in his life about the decision. He never accepted it. He never forgave it. I think it is worth pausing on why this hurt so much. It was not, I suspect, primarily about the title itself, although Edward was certainly conscious of titles. It was about what the title meant. A Royal Highness was, by definition, family. A Royal Highness was, by definition, received at court. A Royal Highness was, by definition, treated with the formal respect that the British royal family extended to its own members. To deny Wallis the style was to declare, in the most permanent, legally enforceable way, that she was not family, would not be received, would not be treated as one of them. It was a permanent constitutional rebuke. Edward read it, correctly, as such, and from the moment he understood what the letters patent said, he never again trusted his family. He spent the rest of his life, more than 35 years, in a quiet, slow, simmering grievance about it. The wedding itself was held on the 3rd of June 1937 at the Château de Candé, a small castle in the Loire Valley, owned by the French-American businessman Charles Bedaux, who had offered it for the occasion. The date was chosen by Edward with deliberate sentimentality. It was the birthday of his late father, George V, the king, who had so often told him that he was not living up to expectations. There was a melancholy edge to the choice that not everyone caught at the time. The wedding party was small. About 20 guests, a few close friends of Edward's, a few of Wallis's old American friends, including Herman and Catherine Rogers, Wallis's aunt Bessie Merriman, who had travelled out from Washington and who, in the absence of Wallis's mother, who had died in 1929, gave the bride away. No member of the royal family attended. Not Edward's mother, not his sister, not any of his 3 brothers. The new king had forbidden any of them to be present. Letters were sent, telegrams were exchanged, but the family stayed away. The Church of England declined to provide an officiant. The wedding was conducted by the Reverend Anderson Jardine, an English clergyman who had volunteered, against the express wishes of his archbishop, to come out from England and perform the ceremony for a couple who were otherwise being denied a religious wedding. The morning of the 3rd of June was warm and bright. The Loire Valley in early June is, by some accounts, at its absolute best. The gardens in full leaf, the days long, the evenings still cool enough to be comfortable. The chateau itself, set in its park, had been decorated with simple white flowers from the local nurseries. There was no extravagance. There was no ostentation. The mood throughout the morning was quiet and slightly tense. Wallis dressed in an upstairs bedroom that she had been using since her arrival at the chateau in early May. Her Aunt Bessie was with her. The dressmaker Mainboscher had come from Paris for the final fittings. Edward, in the room across the hall, was being dressed by his valet. He wore morning dress. He carried in his pocket a copy of the prayer book that Jardine had brought with him from England. He had asked Jardine the previous evening whether the form of the service could be modified slightly to accommodate the unusual circumstances. Jardine had refused. The service, he had said, would be performed as it was set out in the Book of Common Prayer, with no modifications. Edward had not pressed the point. The ceremony itself was held in the music room of the chateau, which had been arranged with rows of chairs and a temporary altar at one end. Jardine conducted the service with the kind of quiet professional dignity that the situation required. He read the words. He asked the questions. He pronounced them man and wife. Wallis wore a long dress in a colour that came to be known as Wallis blue, a pale blue-grey that was, the dressmaker Mainboscher said later, designed to match her eyes. Edward wore a morning suit. The ceremony lasted under 20 minutes. There was a reception. There was champagne. The guests danced briefly to a gramophone. There was a wedding lunch afterwards in the main dining room of the chateau. The wedding cake, which had been made by the local pâtissier, was cut by the bride and groom in the traditional manner. Speeches were brief. Bessie Merriman, slightly tearful, made a few remarks about Wallis's mother and what she would have thought of this day. Herman Rogers, the closest male friend Wallis had, gave a toast that emphasized the friendship and the loyalty that, he said, would carry the new couple through whatever came next. Edward, when his turn came to speak, was unexpectedly emotional. He thanked the small group for being there. He thanked them for being, in a moment when so much of what he had been raised to count on had absented itself, the people who had not absented themselves. He looked several times at his wife. He did not, by any account of those present, mention his family. The afternoon was for photographs. The official photographer had been brought in from London. He took, over the next several hours, the series of formal portraits that would, in the days that followed, be released to the world's press as the official record of the wedding. The photographs are, even now, slightly haunting. Wallis, in her pale dress, looks composed but not radiant. Edward, in his morning suit, looks happy in a slightly distracted way. Both of them, in every photograph, carry the small, hard-to-name quality of people who have just been through something they have not yet fully processed. By early evening, the guests had begun to leave. The chairs had been folded away. The wedding cake had been mostly eaten. The staff was beginning the slow work of restoring the music room to its ordinary configuration. Wallis went upstairs to change. Edward, in the drawing room, drank a final glass of champagne with Herman Rogers and discussed, with what was reported as a kind of forced cheerfulness, the plans for the honeymoon That evening, the new Duke and Duchess of Windsor left for a honeymoon in Austria. The world watched. The British royal family was silent. They were now, both of them, exiles. He, voluntarily. She, by the family decision that she would not be received at court. They had each other. But they had, as it turned out, a substantial income from the financial settlement. They had a network of houses and friends across Europe. They had no children, would have no children, were entering the second half of their lives with the question of what, exactly, they would now do with themselves. The answer for the next 35 years was very little, or rather very little of any consequence. I want to be careful with the years that follow, because they are easy to misread. The conventional version of the post-abdication life of the Duke and Duchess of Windsor presents them as glamorous wanderers, hosts of brilliant parties, ornaments of international café society from the late 1930s through the late 1960s. There is some truth to this. They were certainly social. They certainly entertained. They certainly knew through the decades almost every famous person of their era. But underneath the social life there was a long, slow, almost unbearable hollowness that I think is worth naming clearly. Edward had been raised to be a king. He had given that up. He was now a man with no work, no purpose, no formal duties, and no clear sense of what his life was actually for. He filled the days with golf, with shopping, with travel, with endless conversation about the wrongs that had been done to him and to Wallis. The conversation became, over the years, a kind of involuntary tic. Friends who knew them well began to dread it. They could set their watches by the moment in any visit when Edward would begin, again, to revisit the decisions of December 1936 and to explain, again, why everything that had happened to him since then had been unfair. Wallis, at his side, listened. Hour after hour, year after year, decade after decade. There is a remark attributed to her by several of their close friends in the later years that she made privately when she was sure she would not be overheard. The remark was that she sometimes wondered whether she had made the right choice. She had wanted, in 1936, to step back. He had not let her. And now here she was, married to a man whose primary subject of conversation was a throne he had given up on her account. She was the beneficiary of his sacrifice and the daily audience for his regret. It was not by any reading an easy marriage. There were, however, complications even darker than the personal ones. In October of 1937, 4 months after the wedding, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor visited Germany. They met Adolf Hitler at the Berghof, his retreat in the Bavarian Alps. They toured German factories and labour facilities. They were photographed shaking hands with senior figures of the Nazi regime. The trip lasted 11 days. It included visits to factories, to a youth training camp, to a model labour facility, to several German cities. At each stop, the Duke and Duchess were greeted with elaborate formal ceremonies. The Nazi authorities, who had recognized immediately the propaganda value of the visit, deployed every resource to make it as photographically rewarding as possible. Crowds were organized. Bands played. The Duke, in the formal attire that had been arranged for him, gave the ceremonial gestures that the photographs of the trip recorded again and again. The meeting with Hitler at the Berghof, on the 22nd of October, lasted about 2 hours. The Duke and Duchess were received with formal courtesy. They had tea in the famous great room with its enormous picture window over the Bavarian Alps. They discussed, by the records that have survived, the situation in Europe, the question of Anglo-German relations, the prospects for what Hitler called a peaceful resolution of the various continental questions. The Duke spoke, during the meeting, in his good German that he had learned as a child. The Duchess, who spoke no German, smiled politely and waited. The records of the meeting, on both sides, suggest that the conversation was not a serious diplomatic exchange. It was, on Hitler's side, a propaganda event, an opportunity to be photographed with a former King of England in apparent friendship. It was, on the Duke's side, a kind of personal vindication, a moment in which he was treated by one of the most powerful men in the world, with the deference that he believed his former position merited. The photographs that emerged from the trip when they reached the British and American newspapers in late October caused a kind of slow building horror. The Duke shaking hands with Hitler, the Duke and Duchess in formal evening dress at a state dinner with senior Nazi figures. The British public, which had been told for nearly a year that the abdication was a sad personal matter that should not be allowed to obscure the dignity of the new reign, was now confronted with the spectacle of their former king in apparent friendly relations with the political movement that in less than 2 years would plunge the world into the most catastrophic war in its history. The British royal family, when they saw the photographs, were appalled. The new king, George VI in particular, was furious. He had spent the months since the abdication trying to rebuild the prestige of the monarchy. He had spent the months trying to position the family in the public mind as a stable, dignified, conventionally British institution. His brother had now, in 11 days of public diplomacy, undone much of that careful work. The visit was, by every account, a catastrophe of judgment. Edward seems to have understood it as a kind of personal diplomacy, a chance to engage with European leaders in the way he had not been allowed to as king. He may also, at some level that has never been entirely clear, have been sympathetic to certain elements of the German government's worldview. The historians have argued about this for nearly a century. The captured German documents released after the war suggested, at minimum, that he had been more open to certain conversations with German diplomats in 1939 and 1940 than was at all appropriate for a former king of an enemy power. I am going to handle this carefully because the evidence is mixed and the conclusions are contested. The most charitable reading is that Edward was a foolish, vain, politically naive man who was flattered by Hitler's attention and who, in the years before the war, said and did things that he should not have said and done. The least charitable reading is darker. The truth is probably somewhere between them, and the documentary record even now does not entirely settle the question. What is not in doubt is that the British government, when the war began in 1939, did not trust the Duke of Windsor. He was given a series of minor postings designed primarily to keep him out of trouble. He was attached to the British military mission in France, then evacuated to Spain, then to Portugal. In July of 1940, with the Battle of Britain about to begin, the British government made a decision that revealed exactly how worried they were about him. They appointed him governor of the Bahamas. The Bahamas, a colonial outpost in the Caribbean, as far from Europe as it was possible to send him without literally throwing him into the sea. Wallis went with him. She hated the Bahamas. The climate was hot and damp. The social life was provincial. The official duties were minimal. She made the best of it, in her usual capable way. She redecorated the governor's residence. She organized the local Red Cross effort. She became, by every account, a competent and conscientious governor's wife. The Bahamas posting, looking at it from a distance, was a very particular kind of British colonial outpost. Nassau in 1940 was a town of perhaps 30,000 people, divided sharply along racial and economic lines. The white population, mostly British administrative staff, and a wealthy expatriate community, lived in the cooler hill districts and gathered at the local hotels and clubs. The black population, the great majority, lived in the hot lowlands and worked in the service industries on the farms outside town and on the boats that linked the island to the Florida coast. The governorship, in normal times, was the kind of posting given to a competent but unspectacular career colonial administrator. The duties were minimal. The salary was modest. The expectation was that you would maintain order, sign the necessary papers, attend the necessary functions, and not embarrass the crown. For Edward, who had been raised to be the king of the largest empire in history, the posting was a small, specific, daily humiliation. He had to attend the local committee meetings. He had to give the school prize-giving speech. He had to entertain, at the governor's residence, the local merchants and the local clergy and the local representatives of the various trades. He did all of this with reasonable competence, because he had been raised to do precisely this kind of public function in his sleep, but he did it without much real enthusiasm. Wallis, watching, threw herself into the role with more determination than her husband. She was by 1940, in her mid-40s, and she had had, by this point, 4 years to think about what her life as the Duchess of Windsor was actually going to require of her. She had decided, somewhere along the way, that the answer was a kind of focused public competence. If she was going to be denied the formal recognition of the royal family, she would at least be the most useful possible occupant of the various unofficial roles she ended up in. She redecorated the government house at Nassau, which had been allowed to become slightly shabby in the years before the Windsors arrived. She brought in furniture, fabrics, paintings. She turned what had been a slightly dispiriting tropical bungalow into something that, by the accounts of those who visited it, was one of the more elegant official residences in the British colonial system. She also took on the wartime responsibilities that the governor's wife was traditionally expected to manage. She ran the local Red Cross effort. She organised the women's volunteer services. She arranged with the practical efficiency that was by this point a deeply ingrained habit for the various contributions that a colonial outpost could make to the British war effort. There were also episodes during the Bahamas years that have remained controversial. The most notorious involved a murder case, the killing of a wealthy mining magnate who had retired to Nassau in July of 1943. The case was complicated. The investigation was botched. The Duke of Windsor, in his capacity as governor, made several decisions about the handling of the investigation that, decades later, would be subject to considerable historical criticism. The reasons for those decisions have never been entirely clear. The whole episode left a kind of stain on the Bahamas governorship that no amount of subsequent good behaviour could quite remove. There was also, throughout the Bahamas years, a constant low-level worry on the part of the British government about whom the Windsors were associating with. The Bahamas was a transit point for travellers crossing between Europe and the Americas. The Windsors entertained in their official capacity a stream of visitors from both continents. Some of those visitors had political views or business interests that British intelligence felt were not entirely consistent with the war effort. The files from the relevant agencies, when they were eventually opened, showed a pattern of careful, slightly anxious monitoring of who came and went from Government House and what was said over dinner. By 1945, when the war ended and the governorship came to its natural close, the Windsors had been in the Bahamas for 5 years. They were ready to leave. But they had in those 5 years done what was required of them and not very much more. They had also, more importantly for what came next, used the time to consolidate their position as a kind of stateless royal couple, a permanent ornament of international high society without any actual function in any country. But the years of the war, 1940 to 1945, were essentially years of waiting for the war to end, waiting for the political situation to allow some return to a more interesting life, waiting, in a quiet, half-acknowledged way, for the vindication that never quite came. When the war ended in 1945, the Windsors returned to France. Edward was, by this point, in his early 50s. Wallis was 49. They were no longer young. The world they had known in the 1930s was gone. Europe was rebuilding. The royal family in Britain had emerged from the war with enormously enhanced prestige, partly through the performance of the new King and Queen during the bombing of London, partly through the simple fact that they had stayed in their posts when many had advised them to evacuate. The Windsors, by contrast, had spent the war in the Bahamas. They had nothing to point to. They had nothing to claim. The relationship with the family had not improved. The post-war years stretched ahead of them as a long, comfortable, fundamentally purposeless retirement. They settled, eventually, in Paris. The French government, in a gesture of considerable generosity, made available to them a house at 4 Route du Champ d'Entraînement in the Bois de Boulogne, the great park on the western edge of Paris. But the lease was, by careful arrangement, almost free. The house was elegant. The neighbourhood was the most exclusive in Paris. The staff was provided. They lived there for the rest of Edward's life, and, in Wallis's case, for the rest of hers. The decades that followed had a quality that is genuinely difficult to convey. They were not, on the surface, unhappy. The Duke and Duchess gave dinners that were considered among the most elegant in Paris. They travelled. They visited New York, where they were lionized by café society. They appeared in the gossip columns. They were, in their own peculiar way, famous. Let me tell you what their life in Paris actually looked like, day to day, because the surface details are revealing of how a couple constructs an existence around the absence of any particular reason to exist. The house in the Bois de Boulogne was, by every account of those who saw it, beautiful. Wallis had decorated it with the same focused attention she had given to every interior she had ever lived in. The rooms were calm. The colours were carefully chosen. The collection of Chinese porcelain that she had begun to acquire in Peking 30 years earlier had grown by the 1950s into one of the more remarkable private holdings of its kind in Paris. The dining room in particular was admired by everyone who saw it. The proportions were right. The light was right. The table itself, when it was set for one of the Windsor's dinners, was a masterwork of careful arrangement. The staff was substantial. There was a butler. There was a housekeeper. There were maids and a cook and a chauffeur and the various other figures who in the 1950s were still considered necessary for the running of a fashionable Paris establishment. Edward had a valet who had been with him for years. Wallis had a personal maid who travelled with her everywhere. The day began late. Neither of them was an early riser. Edward, by the 1950s, was a man with no formal duties of any kind. He woke when he wanted, breakfasted in his dressing gown, read the newspapers, took a slow morning. Wallis was up earlier by an hour or two, but her mornings were also slow. She wrote letters. She went over the household accounts. She consulted with the cook about the day's meals. Lunches were small. Sometimes just the two of them. Sometimes a single guest, an old friend passing through Paris, a member of the circle of expatriates who had become their regular companions. The food was always excellent. The conversation, by the accounts of those who shared these lunches, could be, depending on Edward's mood, either delightful or exhausting. Afternoons were for shopping or for naps. Wallis was, throughout these years, a serious shopper. She had developed, in her London years, a relationship with the great Paris fashion houses that, after the war, became one of the central features of her life. She bought clothes from Mainbocher, who had designed her wedding dress and who continued to dress her into the 1960s. She bought from Givenchy and Schiaparelli and eventually from the new generation of designers who came up after the war. Her wardrobe, by the time of her death, was one of the most documented in 20th century fashion history. The pieces would decades later be auctioned for sums that would have astonished her in her early days. Evenings were for entertaining or for going out. The Windsors gave perhaps 2 formal dinners a month of 12 or 16 people in the dining room of the Bois de Boulogne house. The guest lists were carefully composed. There was always at least one person of real intellectual or artistic substance to keep the conversation interesting. There was always at least one person of considerable wealth to provide the social ballast. There was always at least one couple from the diminishing circle of European royalty to maintain the protocol of the household. The remaining guests were drawn from a rotating cast of friends, cousins, well-connected Americans passing through Paris, and the occasional curious figure who Wallis had decided would add an unexpected note. When they were not entertaining, they went out. To the houses of friends, to the great hotels for dinner, to the opera occasionally, to the gambling tables at the casinos in Deauville or Monte Carlo, where Edward, who had a small but real taste for cards, played for stakes that were comfortable for him and astonishing to the staff at the casino who watched. They travelled, often, New York every winter, where they kept a suite at the Waldorf Towers, and where the New York gossip columnists and society editors competed to record their movements, Palm Beach in the colder months, London, occasionally, when Edward could be persuaded to come and the family could be persuaded to receive him, the Riviera in the summer, where they had a long-term arrangement at a villa they had rented in the late 1930s and that they continued to use as a summer base into the 1950s, it was by every conventional measure a glamorous life. It was also, by every account of the people who knew them well, a fundamentally hollow one. There was no work, there was no project, there was no future being built. They were, the two of them, occupying a kind of permanent present tense in which every day was a slight variation on every other day, and the only narrative arc they had was the narrative of the abdication, which Edward returned to again and again in the ways I am about to describe. But the underneath was different. Friends who saw them often noticed certain things. Edward, as he aged, became more and more obsessive about the abdication. He could not stop returning to it. Every conversation eventually came back to it. He watched his brother's reign from a distance, with a complicated mixture of resentment and grief. When his brother George VI died in 1952 at the age of 56, partly worn out by a job he had not wanted, Edward felt the death deeply, but also, by some accounts, with an undercurrent of strange relief. The brother who had taken his place was gone. The reproach of his existence was over. But the reproach was not over, not really, because the new monarch was now Queen Elizabeth II, his niece, who had been a child of 10 when he abdicated, and who had watched the whole crisis from inside her own family. Elizabeth was 26 when she came to the throne. She had been raised in a quiet and deliberate way to understand what her uncle had done as a betrayal that her own father had spent his life paying for. She would be perfectly correct toward Edward and Wallis through the rest of their lives. She would not be warm. The visits to England, when they happened, were brief and formal. Edward was permitted to attend his mother's funeral in 1953. He was permitted to attend his sister's funeral in 1965. He was permitted, on a few state occasions, to be received at Buckingham Palace. Wallis was, for most of these decades, not received at all. The HRH question continued to poison the relationship. Edward, every time he was received at the palace, insisted on the protocol that his wife should be addressed as Her Royal Highness. The royal family, every time, declined. The visits were short, awkward, and fundamentally unresolved. By the late 1960s, Edward was visibly aging. He had been a heavy smoker his whole life. By 1971, he was diagnosed with throat cancer. The treatment was painful and partial. By the spring of 1972, he was visibly dying. It was at this point that the royal family did something that even now is moving to read about. Queen Elizabeth II was scheduled to make a state visit to France in May of 1972. She arranged with considerable care to visit her uncle in his Paris house during the visit. She came on the 18th of May, accompanied by her husband, Prince Philip, and by her son, Prince Charles. The Duke was very ill by this point. He was wheeled into the drawing room in a chair with a drip stand beside him to deliver fluids. He insisted, despite his condition, on standing to bow to his niece. The arrangements for the visit had been made through diplomatic channels with the kind of careful layered protocol that the royal household had developed over centuries to handle exactly this kind of difficult occasion. There were memoranda, there were briefings, there were small disputes about exactly which members of the household would be present and which would not. The Queen's private secretary had insisted that the visit be private, with no press, no photographs, no public statements. The French government had agreed. The Windsor's household had been told to expect the Queen at 4 in the afternoon. The house in the Bois de Boulogne had been prepared with the kind of quiet attention that Wallis brought to every important occasion. The drawing room had been arranged so that Edward could be wheeled in from his bedroom and positioned near the window without too much difficulty. Tea had been ordered, although no one expected very much of it would be drunk. A small fire had been lit. despite the warmth of the May afternoon, because Edward, who was now severely thin, was almost always cold. The Queen's car arrived at the gates a few minutes before 4. She had brought, as Wallis had been told to expect, her husband, Prince Philip, and her son, Prince Charles. They were driven up the small drive. They were greeted at the door by Wallis, who had dressed for the occasion in a simple dark dress, and who was, by every account of those who saw her that day, holding herself together with a kind of tight, focused dignity that the Queen's staff would later describe with considerable respect. Wallis curtsied to the Queen. The Queen kissed her on both cheeks. They went into the drawing-room. Edward was there, in his chair, with his drip stand beside him. He had been propped up so that he could see the door. When his niece came into the room, he made his small, terrible effort. He pressed himself up out of the chair. He stood briefly with the help of the chair's arms. He bowed, the small, formal bow of an uncle to a sovereign. He sank back into the chair. The Queen, by the accounts of those present, was visibly moved. She crossed to him. She took his hand. She told him, with the kind of warmth that the formal protocols of these visits do not normally permit, that she was glad to see him. The conversation that followed was, by every account, gentle. The Queen asked about his health. She asked about his treatment. She asked about the people in the household. Edward, who could speak only with effort, answered as best he could. Prince Charles, who had been close to the Duke at certain points in his own life, asked about a project they had once discussed together. Wallis, on the edge of the conversation, contributed quietly, refilled the teacups, watched her husband with the kind of vigilance that wives of dying men know. The visit lasted 15 minutes. The Queen was warm. She asked after his health. She talked about the family. Wallis was present for some of the visit. The Queen addressed her, not by name but politely, and accepted her hospitality. They were not granted very much in those 15 minutes. They were not granted everything they had wanted, but for the first time in 35 years, the formal coldness of the family was, for a quarter of an hour, set aside. 10 days later, on the 28th of May 1972, Edward died at his house in Paris. He was 77. He died slowly across those 10 days. The throat cancer had moved into his lungs and his lymph nodes. He was, by the morning of the 28th, in and out of consciousness. Wallis sat with him through the final night, in the bedroom of the Bois de Boulogne house that had been their shared room for nearly 2 decades. The doctor was present. The valet was nearby. The lights were low. Edward, in his last hours, opened his eyes occasionally and looked at her, and she sat with her hand in his, and the small, ordinary intimacy of a married couple at the end of a long life played out in the way it has played out in millions of bedrooms through the centuries. The household, when the death was announced later that morning, performed the small mechanical tasks that the loss of a head of household generates. The doctor signed the papers. The lawyer was telephoned. The Buckingham Palace press office was informed. The arrangements for the body to be flown back to England, which had been planned in considerable detail over the previous several weeks of his decline, were activated. Wallis, in the days that followed, was very still. She wrote a small number of letters in her own hand, to old friends, to her aunt's surviving relatives in America, to Herman and Catherine Rogers's surviving family, who were by this point among the closest connections she still had to the friends of her young womanhood. She received a small number of visitors. She made the necessary decisions about the funeral arrangements in consultation with the British royal household, with the kind of focused efficiency that those who saw her in those days described as somehow more impressive than tears would have been. His body was flown back to England for the funeral. He was given a private service at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the chapel of the British monarchy. Wallis flew to England in a small RAF plane that had been sent for her at the personal direction of the Queen. She was met at the airport, taken to Buckingham Palace, where she was given a small private suite of rooms for the days of the funeral. It was the first time in nearly 35 years that she had been received by the royal family with anything resembling formal hospitality. She was treated, throughout those days at the palace, with a kind of careful, distant courtesy. The Queen visited her in her rooms. The Queen Mother, who was now Edward's elderly sister-in-law and who had been one of his most determined opponents within the family throughout his life, did not visit. The other members of the family came in and out, with varying degrees of warmth. The funeral itself was attended by every senior member of the royal family. Wallis sat in the front pew, in a small simple black dress and a small black hat. She wept, quietly, at certain moments of the service. The hymns were the ones Edward had chosen long before, in the discussions about funeral arrangements that he and Wallis had had in the years when his health had begun to decline. He was buried in the royal burial ground at Frogmore, on the Windsor estate. Wallis attended. She was, by every account of the people who saw her at the funeral, a small, frail, grief-stricken woman in black. She was photographed walking beside Queen Elizabeth in the funeral procession. The photograph is one of the most haunting in the entire archive of the British royal family in the 20th century. Two women, separated by everything, walking beside each other for a few minutes in 1972 because the man between them had loved them both. Edward was buried at Frogmore in a small private ceremony attended only by the immediate family and by Wallis. The grave was marked with a simple stone. The royal family began to disperse. Wallis was driven back to the palace. The next morning, she was driven to the airport and flown back to Paris. Wallis returned to Paris alone. She had 14 years left. The 14 years that followed are difficult to write about, and I want to do so carefully. In the immediate aftermath of Edward's death, Wallis was lucid, social, and as elegant as ever. She was 76. She was wealthy, well-known, and surrounded by friends. She continued to entertain, on a smaller scale than before. She gave occasional interviews. She received visitors, but the slow erosion of mind that would mark her last decade had already begun. By the mid-1970s, friends began to notice that her memory was not what it had been. She became confused about names and dates. She had small, embarrassing lapses at dinner parties. The lapses grew. By the late 1970s, she was rarely seen in public. Let me tell you what those last years actually looked like, because they are, in their way, one of the saddest chapters in this whole story, and they have been ignored or simplified in most accounts. In the immediate years after Edward's death, from 1972 through about 1975, Wallis maintained the surface of her life. She was, in those years, in her late 70s. She was still, by every account, a small, elegant, fiercely composed woman who appeared at restaurant dinners with a small group of close friends, who continued to oversee the running of the household at the Bois de Boulogne, who continued to manage her correspondence with care. She also, in those years, made one decision that would shape everything that came afterwards. She gave full power of attorney over her affairs to her French lawyer, Maître Suzanne Blum. The figure who controlled access to Wallis in these years was a French lawyer named Maître Suzanne Blum. Blum had handled Wallis's affairs for years and had, after Edward's death, become her formal legal representative. Blum was, by background, a serious figure. She was one of the most respected lawyers in Paris, with a long career in commercial and family law, and a reputation for absolute discretion. She had begun handling Wallis's affairs in the 1960s, when Edward had still been alive. She had, throughout the years of Edward's decline and the years immediately afterwards, served Wallis well. She had managed the legal arrangements for Edward's estate. She had handled the negotiations with the British royal household over the various financial matters that had to be resolved. She had advised Wallis on how to manage her own affairs. In about 1975, the relationship began to change. The exact moment of the change is difficult to identify, but by the late 1970s, the people who tried to visit Wallis at the Bois de Boulogne house were beginning to find that they could not get past Blum. Calls were refused. Letters went unanswered. The few visitors who did make it to the house were told by Blum or by Blum's representatives that the Duchess was not well enough to receive them. As Wallis's mind declined, Blum's control over her household, her finances, and her public image grew. By the early 1980s, Blum had, by every account of the friends who tried to visit, become an absolute gatekeeper. The old friends who came to call were turned away. The journalists who asked for interviews were refused. Wallis herself, by this point, was bedridden, semi-conscious for long periods, and entirely unable to manage her own affairs. The household at the Bois de Boulogne in those last years became a kind of fortress. The staff was rotated. The old servants who had been with Wallis for decades were, one by one, replaced or pensioned off. The new staff reported to Blum rather than to the Duchess. The doctors who attended her were chosen by Blum. The decisions about her care were made by Blum. The circumstances of these years troubled the people who had known Wallis well. They troubled the friends who tried to call and were turned away at the door. They troubled the old society figures who had known her since the 1930s. They troubled, most of all, those who suspected that Blum was, in various ways, isolating Wallis from her own life. Some of the people who watched all this from the outside have argued, in the years since, that Blum was simply doing her job. The Duchess was severely ill. She required protection from the curious, from the predatory, from the journalists and biographers who would have descended on her in her diminished state if Blum had not held them off. The arrangements that look, from the outside, like isolation were, on this account, the necessary protections of a woman who could no longer protect herself. Other observers have taken a darker view. They have argued that Blum, beyond a certain point, became attached to her own role as gatekeeper in ways that were not entirely about Wallis's welfare. They have noted that Blum sold, during this period, certain pieces from Wallis's collection of jewels and decorative objects, and that the proceeds went to fund what Blum described as the Duchess's care, but that the accounting was opaque. They have noted that Blum gave interviews and wrote articles about Wallis during these years that, while always presented as defending the Duchess against her critics, also kept Blum herself in the public eye in ways that benefited Blum's own reputation. The truth of what happened in those last years has never been entirely established. Blum maintained until her own death that she had cared for Wallis with absolute fidelity. The friends who were turned away maintained that something was deeply wrong. The Duchess of Windsor herself, by the early 1980s, was no longer in any condition to confirm or deny anything. The house during these years slowly became less like a home and more like a quiet, sealed room at the end of a long story. The dinners stopped. The rooms were closed up one by one. The wardrobe, the famous wardrobe with its hundreds of dresses, was put into storage. The staff dwindled. By the early 1980s, the house had only a small number of permanent occupants, and most of them rarely saw the Duchess they were ostensibly serving. She lived in her bed in the house in the Bois de Boulogne for 14 years after Edward's death. She did not, by any account that has survived, speak much in those last years. She did not entertain. She did not appear in public. She was, in the most literal sense, withdrawn. She died on the 24th of April, 1986. She was 89 years old. Her body was flown to England for the funeral. The funeral was held at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, the same chapel where Edward had been buried 14 years earlier. The Queen attended. The royal family attended. The service was brief and dignified. She was buried beside Edward in the royal burial ground at Frogmore. The headstones are simple. His says Edward. Hers says Wallis. They lie next to each other, in the family burial ground that in her lifetime had not received her. Before I get to the question I have been turning over across this entire story, let me say something about how the story of Wallis Simpson has been told over the decades since her death, because the telling itself is part of the story. In the years immediately after her death in 1986, the Wallis Simpson who emerged in the popular accounts was almost entirely the legend Wallis, the schemer, the seductress, the American adventuress who had, through some combination of charm and cunning and rumoured dark arts, brought down a king. The dominant biographies of those years, working with limited access to the surviving documents and with the strong current of received opinion behind them, presented her as a kind of one-dimensional villain whose role in the abdication required no further explanation. That version began to soften, slowly, in the 1990s and 2000s, as more documents became available. The diaries of certain courtiers, the official files of the British government, the personal letters of Wallis herself to her Aunt Bessie, all of these began to circulate among historians and to complicate the simple story. The Wallis who emerged in these later accounts was a more recognizable human being, less a villain, more a person. The most thoroughgoing rehabilitation came in the early 2010s when the British biographer Anne Seber published a book called That Woman, which drew on a much wider range of primary sources than any previous biography, and which presented a Wallis who was in many ways the opposite of the popular legend. Seber's Wallis was a clever, ambitious, anxious, sometimes frightened American woman whose role in the abdication was much more complicated and much more sympathetic than the previous accounts had allowed. The book changed the conversation among serious historians of the period. It did not, however, much change the conversation among the general public. The popular legend, the one that gets repeated in newspaper articles and in the framing of new films and television series, is remarkably persistent. It survives because it satisfies certain narrative needs. It gives the abdication a clear cause. It gives the institution of the British monarchy a clean villain who can be blamed for everything that went wrong. It allows the country even now to maintain the comforting fiction that what happened in 1936 was not a structural problem with how the institution had raised its heir, but a contingent personal disaster that could have been avoided if the wrong woman had simply not crossed the king's path. The legend has proved unusually resistant to correction because correcting it would require accepting something that is harder to accept, namely, that Edward, the man who gave up the throne, was not a victim of seduction. He was a man whose adult life had been one long, increasingly uncomfortable flight from the role he had been raised for. He had been having complicated relationships with married women for 15 years before he met Wallis. He had been complaining, to anyone who would listen, about the burdens of his future kingship for at least as long. He had been signalling, in 100 small ways, that he was not going to be the king the country expected him to be. Wallis was not the cause of the abdication. Wallis was the occasion for it. Edward, on some level, had been waiting for an excuse to refuse the throne for years. Wallis became, in the end, the excuse he had been waiting for. That is a darker reading of the story, in some ways, than the legend. The legend lets Edward off the hook by treating him as the seduced, the bewitched, the romantic hero whose love for an unworthy woman drove him to a decision he should not have made. The actual record suggests something more uncomfortable. Edward made the decision because, at the deepest level, he wanted to make it. Wallis gave him the cover he needed to make the decision he had been working toward, in his own private psychology, for most of his adult life. This does not absolve Wallis. She knew, by 1936, what she had become to him. She knew that she had become his exit. She could have, with greater self-awareness or greater courage, refused that role. She did not. She allowed herself to be, in her own quiet way, the door he was reaching for. But it also does not make her the villain. A villain causes things to happen. Wallis, in this reading, did not cause anything. She permitted, she enabled, she failed to refuse a role that was being pressed on her by a man more powerful than herself. The moral weight of that failure is real, but it is not the moral weight of villainy. It is the moral weight of an ordinary human being who, in an extraordinary situation, did not find within herself the strength to step away. I want to close with a question, the one I have been turning over in my own mind over the years that I have spent thinking about this story. Was Wallis Simpson the villain of this story? The popular version says yes. The popular version has, for nearly a century, presented her as the cause of the abdication, the destroyer of a king, the foreign woman who stole something precious and gave nothing in return. The actual record is, I think, considerably different. Wallis did not set out to become the most consequential figure in 20th century British royal history. She was an American woman of modest means who, through a combination of circumstance, charm, and the particular psychological shape of the man she met, ended up at the center of a constitutional crisis that no one, including her, had wanted. When the crisis came, she tried to step back. When her efforts to step back were refused, she did the only thing she could do, which was to follow the man who had given up his throne for her into a long exile that turned out to be in many ways less a romance than a slow shared imprisonment. She was not innocent. She had used her charm. She had taken the king's gifts. She had allowed the relationship to develop in ways that, with greater self-awareness or greater courage, she might have stopped. She was, in the ordinary human sense, complicit in what happened. But she was not the villain. She was not the schemer. She was not the cause. The cause, if we are looking for one, was a man who could not bear to be alone. A man who had been told for 40 years that he was the future of England, and who, when the future actually arrived, discovered that he did not want it. A man who reached for the first person who had ever talked to him as if he were a person rather than a prince, and who, having reached for her, would not let her go even when she tried to go. That man was Edward, the prince, the king, the duke, the long unhappy figure, whose life had been arranged for him from his birth and whose only major decision was to refuse the arrangement. Wallis was not his villain. She was not his victim. She was the woman he chose, and she was, it seems to me, the woman who paid the highest price for being chosen. She paid it across 50 years. She paid it in the loss of her American life, her London social position, her ordinary marriage, her possible second husband, her possible children. She paid it in the long exile, the constant performance, the daily audience to a man whose primary subject of conversation was the throne he had given up. She paid it in the slow erosion of her last decade, alone in a Paris house that had once been famous for its dinners and that ended as a kind of well-appointed silence. That is the woman behind the scandal. Not a sorceress, not a schemer, not a foreign manipulator. A clever, watchful, charming American woman who had been raised to make herself indispensable to people who could help her, and who, in the most catastrophic application of that childhood lesson, made herself indispensable to a man who could not have helped her less if he had tried. Thank you for travelling this road with me, all 12 parts of it. The story of Wallis Simpson is, in many ways, the story of what happens when a person who has been raised to be small encounters, a person who has been raised to be enormous, and the small person discovers that being indispensable to the enormous person is not, in the end, the same thing as being safe. If any part of this story stayed with you, if something you had assumed turned out to be different from what you thought, if you came to the end with a slightly different sense of who Wallis Simpson actually was, then I am glad. That was the journey we set out to make. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before we close. When you stand today in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, and you look at the small, simple stones at the Royal Burial Ground at Frogmore, you are looking at the resting place of a woman who, for most of her adult life, was kept at arm's length by the family she had married into. The stones are unadorned. The graves are not signposted. The royal family that for 50 years declined to receive her has in death allowed her to lie within their grounds. It is a quiet, almost grudging acceptance, half a century late. But it is there. She rests, finally, where her husband rests, in the green peace of the Windsor estate. The two of them together, in a place that, in her lifetime, had not been hers to claim. That is, perhaps, the only resolution a story of this kind ever gets. There is another story coming, another era, another set of human ambitions, another moment when a private life and a public history collided in ways that nobody at the time entirely understood. I think, if you have come this far with me, you will want to know that one too. Until then, take care of yourself. Take care of the people in your life. And remember, when you are tempted to assign someone the easy role of villain in a story you have been told, that the actual person, the woman or the man behind the scandal, was almost always more complicated, more frightened, and more human than the legend allowed them to be. Good night.